If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 66. Boom. Please read the message at the bottom of the story. But something needed to be done before I could go for the cloaked figure. I needed to take care of these werewolves. At the moment I was blocking one attack after another, and I had no idea how strong the cloaked figure might be. And by any chance the cloaked figure is an actual opponent that could cause me damage. The last thing I needed to do was concentrate on dodging pot shots from the werewolves, while dodging blows from an actual threat. And pulse, if all the cloaked figure was doing, is dancing, he wasn't my problem at the moment. So deciding to just let the cloaked figure do his thing, I decided to deal with the werewolves first. By this point, I had already taken out around 200 werewolves, with a little over 1,000 still coming for me. Moving with a graceful speed, I zoomed through the horde, cutting off heads and limbs with precision. Every now and then, I would shoot off an aura wave, turning the closest werewolves into mush, while sending these farther out werewolves back and into each other. All the while I twirled my glowing sword around in a magnificent light show, cutting werewolves into pieces. Dodging a ferocious swipe from a werewolf, I grabbed its outstretched arm, and kicked its chest, ripping the arm off in a spray of crimson blood that covered me, but I was already drenched from head to toe in blood, so it made no difference. Using the arm, I threw it at another werewolf that was going for a lunge. The limb hit the beast on the face, redirecting its trajectory away from me, while I stepped to the side, chopping its head off. I can't keep this up, I thought, as more and more werewolves continued to come at me. Unlike the battle against the Romanian coven, where I had Jane, Julius, along with a few hundred other vampires to help deal with them, I was now taking on about the same number of beasts that are just as strong as the newborns we fought, all by myself, which is causing me to run out of steam, and quickly. Even though I had gotten stronger since that battle, I hadn't gotten strong enough to take on these odds. Looking inside myself, I mentally looked at the amount of aura I still had inside. Not bad, I thought, as I felt the amount of energy that I still had. I guess we might as well go all out, I thought as I chuckled. Continuing to swing my sword at the oncoming werewolves, I opened my free hand, and let an aura ball appear. Starting out small, the aura ball grew and grew, until I had no more aura energy to give it. The aura ball was nearly 3 times the size of a basketball, and was shining like a small sun in my hand. But what really shocked me, is what the orb started to do. As it grew in size, the aura started to darken in color. By the time I was out of energy to give, the orb was a deep indigo, but still managing to shine brightly. Holy fuck, I thought, as I looked down at the blinding purple light. Never before had I pushed this much energy into an aura ball before, and in all honesty it frightened me a bit. An aura ball the size of a baseball could do some serious damage, and what I was about to release could be catastrophic. But I didn't have much of a choice at the moment, so I decided I wanted it to do as much damage as possible. If I was to just point it in one direction, all of its damage would be in that one direction instead of all around me. But what about down? I thought. If I was to aim it at the ground, that would cause a massive explosion that might actually work. Either way, I needed to get rid of this thing soon, because the longer I hold it, the harder it got to keep the orb stable. Thinking fast, I spotted a werewolf jumping over one of its companions and towards me. The beast managed to get about 6 feet off the ground, when I jumped up, using its head as an extra boost as I shot into the air. With my strength and speed, I managed to get a little under 100 feet up, before I twisted my body midair, so I was upside down. Glancing down, I saw all of the werewolves looking up at me, but all I could do was let out a mad chuckle, as I spotted the still dancing figure. 2 birds, 1 stone, I thought, as I released the orb from my hand, shooting it down to earth like a blazing meteorite, right at the cloaked figure's head. The orb shot away like a missile, as I watched. It flew for less than a second before it hit pay dirt. And in a flash of bright light, the orb exploded, and a lot of shit happened really fast. Underscore 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 John/Henry POV, 3rd person. Sitting by the small campfire, Henry stared mindlessly into the relaxing flickering of the warm fire. As he sat on watch, he held the still sheathed knife that was given to him only a few hours before. I can't wait to get home. With how much we are going to get paid for only a few years of travel, I'm going to be set for life. Maybe I can buy Old Man Harold's tavern, and marry his daughter. Henry thought with a small chuckle, as he delved deeper into his imagination. Off to one side of the fire, was John, who was snoring away happily in his own dream of riches and coin, while he clutched the sword tightly to his chest, as if it was his lover. While on the other side, slept the two children, who hadn't woken or moved since Adam's departure. And as always, the unnamed horse munched away at some grass, as it was tied to a tree close to the cart. As Henry dreamed away in his head, he missed the far-off sounds of explosion that rang out. But what he, along with everyone in the camp, horse included, didn't miss, was the sound of a massive explosion. Standing to his feet, Henry ignored John, as he screamed and sat upright, while pulling at the sword, trying to unsheath it, but having no luck. "By God, what is that?" John said, as he looked in all directions. "I don't know," Henry said, as he turned to look around, when something caught his eye. To his left, far off in the distance in the sky, a light orange hue could be seen. "John, look," Henry said, as he pointed at the distant light that could be seen through the thick forest trees. Standing to his feet, John walked over to stand next to Henry. Isn't that the direction Adam went?" John asked, as he turned to look at Henry. "Oh, I believe it is," Henry said, without looking away from the fading light. But before either of them could say anything else, a small voice spoke from behind them. Both startled, John and Henry turned around, ready for a brawl. But what met them was the two small children. The older of the two, Gerard, stood in front of his smaller brother Oliver, who was peeking from behind his brother. "Oh, hello," John said, giving them a small wave. Both of them looked at him, not understanding his words, but getting the gesture. Raising his hand, Gerard waved back. "Ah, see, they can understand us," John said with a chuckle. "No, you don't," Adam said. "They can't speak English." "Well, he must be wrong." Looking at the two, John spoke. "You can understand me, can't you?" But like before, both of them stared blankly at them. "I told you," Henry said with a chuckle. "Shut it," John said, annoyed. Chapter 67, What Remains? Third person. Adam didn't exactly know what happened after he was consumed by the massive fireball that swallowed him whole. For a while, he felt like a piece of clothes in the dryer, constantly spinning around like a ragdoll. Maybe if he didn't feel like he had just been bitch-slapped by the sun, he would have noticed the fact that he was now falling, and picking up speed. When the fireball from the blast hit him, it melted much of his skin, making it impossible for him to open his eyes and see what was happening. But there would have been nothing he could have done, even if he could see. But thankfully, after a few minutes, the itchy feeling of his healing started to cover him, from head to toe, and shortly after he was finally able to open his eyes. But all he was met with was a glimpse of the fast approaching ground. But by then, he was already screwed, and didn't have time to stop his in-air flipping, and just braced himself for impact. The pain was like being pricked by a needle. Short, and quick. Notice how I didn't say painful. That's because, by some stroke of luck, he landed on his back, breaking his spine almost completely, making the pain he would have felt non-existent. But all the same, his vision went blank as he impacted, his brain smashing around the inside of his skull. Adam POV. I don't know how long it took for me to come back to consciousness. But when I did, there was little I could do. I was numb and couldn't feel anything but my face, which at first freaked me out to no end. This was the first time I had paralyzed myself after all. But like always, I slowly started to heal myself. With cracks and the occasional pop, my spine started to realign itself back to its original straight self, as well as heal any of the other broken bits and pieces of myself that I got during my great fall back to earth. As I waited, feeling slowly came back to me. It was that annoying feeling you get when you fall asleep on your arm, where it feels like a million small needles pricking you. But instead of just my arm, it covered my whole body. "Ah, shit!" I groaned, when the feeling finally started to fade. Slowly, I sat up. I should have just stayed in England, people finding out who I am, be damned, I thought. Rolling my head around to get rid of the stiffness, I finally looked up at the damage I had created. Holy fuck! I unconsciously let out as I looked around. At the moment I was in a small crater, which was only about a foot deep, leaving me able to see out. What was once a small clearing with green grass, and trees surrounded it, was now a scene of no man's land. Slowly standing to my feet, I realized I was now in the nude. Damn! I thought, thinking of the fine silks I had just lost. Fuck it, they were already covered in blood anyways. Now standing, I got an even better view of my surroundings. The clearing that had once been about the size of a baseball field, had now tripled in size. With the trees that had once surrounded it gone, with nothing more than the charred stumps left as reminders of the large trees that had once stood there proudly and alive. The ground itself was covered in ash, that would toss up small plumes of it every time I took a step. After a moment I finally realized what the ash had come from. The werewolves. I thought, slightly creeped out at the thought I was being covered in the cremated remains of crazed beasts that had once been human. It really wasn't that really bothered me though. It was the fact I was currently going free willy at the moment, and the bits I don't want to be covered in cremated remains are being covered in it by me walking. Putting that to the back of my mind for the moment, I continued to make sure nothing else had survived the blast. Turning around, I saw that less than 100 feet from where I stood, was another much larger crater, which must have been where the orb had impacted. But something more important popped into my head before I started to walk towards the crater. When I turned my head, something felt off. Doing it again, I again felt weird for some reason. What the hell? I thought, now continuously turning my head side to side, like a crazy person. What is missing here? Dropping to my knees, I brought both my hands to my head and let out a cry as I realized what was gone. No, not my hair! I yelled, as I felt my smooth head. What I had been missing was the feeling of my long hair on my shoulders. For thousands of years my hair had been one of the only constants in my life, while the rest of the world was constantly changing. And now that it was gone, a pit formed in my stomach, and a scar on my soul. Yes, I knew I would grow it back, but still, the mental damage of not having it hurt quite a bit. Feeling a cool breeze on my now bald head, I couldn't help but shake my head. There's no use crying about it now, it's already gone. I thought, and I stood back up to my feet, and dusted as much of the ash off of me as I could. But I'm still pissed. I thought, angered. Looking around the dark clearing one more thing caught my eye. The crater. Making my way over, I stopped at the edge and looked down. The crater was about 10 feet deep, and 15 feet wide. Making for one impressive hole. At the bottom of the crater was something white. It's that thing's cloak. I thought, as I leapt down, to search what was left of it. Crouching down I picked up the few remaining pieces of cloth that somehow remained. Lifting up some of the fabric, I didn't find anything, just more ash. Not too strong now are you little shit? I said, remembering when I was hesitant to fight it. Well, I guess I can get out of here now. I said out loud to myself. This chapter is short, I know, but this whole arc kinda sucked for me, and made me not want to write this fanfic anymore. Because I really want to get to the main story instead of all this small stuff. Plus it's taking me way too long to get it over with, making my wish to write smaller and smaller. For that reason, there is only going to be one more chapter, before some time skips. Or well, they won't be time skips. I'm going to summarize what Adam does in a chunk of years. Like when he meets some important people, or what he does in some important periods of time, before some stuff starts to happen, setting off the start of the main story plot. For this chapter I was going to have the MC fight the big werewolf and all that, but I just couldn't find it in me to write it. Maybe someday, when I'm motivated enough, I will come back to this chapter and write that into the story. Because I know the MC won't be bitten, so it won't really affect the story any. And sorry to those who might have been looking forward to this. Chapter 68, The Circle. Sullen, I made my way back to camp, grumbling the whole way as I absent-mindedly rubbed my head. Should have just stayed in London. It took me until first light to pass the abandoned town, which I stayed away from. By this point, the smell from the bodies would have been terrible. As I got closer to the camp, my nose picked up the smell of cooking meat. Is that my bacon? I thought, as I tilted my head to get a better whiff. They better not have. Quickly making my way through the thick brush, I stumbled into the campsite, before I had to quickly duck my head, under a swinging sword. Bandits, John yelled, as he swung at me again. Grabbing the sword at the hilt, I yanked it from his weak grip before he could finish his drawback and swing. John, it's M. I tried to say, before I had to take a step back, to let Henry come tumbling past us, to fall flat on his face, as he had tried to tackle me to the ground with the dagger I had given him in hand. John, it's me, Adam. I said, before he could start trying to fight me with his fists. He stared at me for a moment, when his eyes slowly started to widen. My goodness man, what happened to you, and your clothes? He asked surprised. I kinda got caught up in some fire, and let's just say, I couldn't get away fast enough. The fire, in the sky, Henry wheezed from the ground, as he tried to get air back into his lungs from his hard fall. Yes, you must have been there. John said, as he finally relaxed. Right, well, it's cold, so I'm going to put on some of my clothes. I said awkwardly, as I covered my manhood with my hands. Oh right, ugh, cough yup. John said, as he looked away from me, as I made my way to the cart. As I went, I looked back to the camp, where I expected to see the kids. But they weren't there. Stopping dead, I turned to look at John and Henry, who was just making it back to his feet. Where is Oscar and Gerard? I asked. Pointing past me at the cart, John said. Behind the cart. Turning back to the cart, I crouched to look under the cart, and saw both of them huddled behind one of the wheels. You can come out, it's me Adam, I said in their language. Gerard's head turned in surprise as he heard me. Leaning over, I grabbed one of my bags that had my clothes, as I heard both boys standing. Getting myself clothed in a blur of motion, I was decent again, before they came around the car to see me. And the surprise was instant as both of their mouths fell open when they saw me. Yeah, I know, I look great, don't I? I said with a smile, as I leaned back into the car to get a pair of footwear. The reunion was fun for me, and got my mind off my own problems. Well, today is the day we will be heading into France, I said to the boys as Henry and John started to pack up the camp. To France? Olivier said in a high-pitched voice. That's right. I said with a smile, as those were the first words he had said to me. The biggest city in these parts. I said. And where will we go? Gerard asked. Well, with us of course, if that is what the both of you want, unless you have somewhere you would rather go. I asked. Both boys shook their heads. Very well. I said, smiling again. For some reason their acceptance made me happy, which confused me. Taking a second to think back, I tried to think of times I was happy about something, and realized it had been a while. I had Julius and Jane back home, which was nice, but I never really had anything in my life to bring me happiness. Sure, I have traveled the known world more times than I care to remember, and I have done some incredible stuff, but after a while that sort of life gets old. Shut up with the sappy shit, Adam, I thought to myself. We should be there by midday, so once we are there, we can get the both of you some new clothes. I said, standing up as the horses were attached to the cart. Lifting up Olivier, I carried him to the cart, while his brother followed closely. Setting Oliver into the back of the cart, I then lifted Gerard, and did the same. All right, we are set, so let's get moving. I said to John, who had the horse's reins in hand. Like I had said, we could see the large stone walls of the city by mid-afternoon. Would you look at that? Henry said, as we stopped on the busy road. Nothing like home, John added. What do you mean? I asked, as I stopped next to him. You know the wall. He said, not looking at me, and pointing at the walls. I looked at him. London has stone walls. I said. He looked at me. It does. Yet I said, confused. Can you get a move on, your cart is taking up most of the road. An old man behind us, also with a cart, yelled. Turning, I waved my hand. My apologies, my companions have never seen stone walls. I said, before turning back to John. Let's go, we're holding up the road. I said, before we started off again. This Paris was quite the experience for me as well as John, Henry, and apparently Gerard and Oliver, who had never left their village before. The line leading to the North City Gate, where we had come from, was long. And I mean, what the fuck is taking so long? Long. After standing around for about 30 minutes I got tired of the waiting, and just told John to follow me. Walking past the line of people, we quickly made it to the gate, which was guarded by a group of men wearing armor chest plates, and helmets. They were searching every bag, and going through every cart. As we made it to the front of the line, one of the guards had spotted our approach. Stepping away from his men, the guard captain raised his hand to us. Whoa, and what do you think you are doing? He asked, anger lacing his words. It's simple really, we're skipping the line. I said with a smile. The guard looked at us as if I was dumb. You can't just skip the line, All these people have been waiting as well. Oh, well then. I said, looking back at the long line of angry face, that were looking right at us. But what if I gave you this, and you just let us in? I said, raising a medium-sized purse that kinked as I raised it. 15 gold coins, of the finest purity. I whispered to him with a smile. The guard's eyes widened as he looked at the bag. A part of me expected drool to start coming out of his mouth, as he stared at the pouch. Slowly, he raised his hands, and grabbed the bag, then opened it. "Oh my!" he said in a whisper as his hands started to shake. Which didn't surprise me. It's not every day someone hands you a month's wage just to let them skip a line. Yeah, yes sir, right away sir," the man said, with the widest smile he could possibly make. I smiled, as he backpedaled to his men. "Move, get them back so this noble can enter," he shouted at his men, getting them to move. As the entrance was cleared, we walked in, as the guard captain gave me a slight bow. I gave him a sheepish smile. "How much did you just give him?" John whispered. "Oh, just 15 gold," I said, not noticing when John stopped walking by me. "What?" he shouted at me, catching the attention of others who were passing us. Turning to look at him, I raised a brow. "What?" I asked. Coming close to whisper in my ear, he explained. "That's nearly 3 years' wage." I looked at him confused. "Really?" "Yes." Well, it has been a while since I bribed someone, and money doesn't really mean anything to me anymore, so it's not a problem, I have plenty more," I said with a shrug, as I turned to start walking again, missing when John stumbled a few times from lightheadedness. Finding the nicest inn in the richest area of all of Paris, I got 2 rooms, one for myself and one for Oliver and Gerard, while John and Henry would be sleeping with the horses in the stables. As we walked in, I was grateful that there weren't any nude women serving drinks to its patrons, like were common in Rome, in the more upper-class inns. Instead they now wore dresses, but still did the same job with a lot of extras for the right price. After getting the rooms for the next few days while we explored, and I found out where I was to meet with the Crusade army. Once John and Henry brought my stuff to my room, we all headed out to go find some clothes for Oliver and Gerard. It only took us a few minutes to find the right place. At its door it had a large wooden sign with a needle and thread, signifying it as a trailer shop. Both boys had stars in their eyes as they experienced everything. All of this was new to them, with sights and smells they had never known existed. That's if you could smell past the shit that caused the streets to reek. Both boys were set with 4 outfits, of various colors and designs. To them the clothes were nice and felt better than anything they had ever worn before, but to others they looked like the children of some very rich nobles. Leaving the shop, Henry and John carried the chest full of their clothes behind us, as me and the kids stopped at any store that caught their attention. By the time it got dark, both John and Henry were laden with various items I had bought for myself or the kids. That night me and the kids sat down for a nice meal of steak at the inn, where our female server gave me the googly eyes the whole time, making sure to always bend over more than was necessary, to give me a good look at her cleavage. But there wasn't a chance in hell she would gain my attention, she didn't have near enough teeth, or anything resembling a pretty face. But other than that, our meal was great, and we devoured our food. What surprised me, was when Gerard had told me that in the last few days, they had eaten more meat than in their entire life. But then I remembered that most people of this time were quite sparse, and didn't really contain meat, or at the least very little. But since I had come here, meat had been a staple of my own diet, but that's because I could simply hunt what I wanted when I wanted to, as easily as going to a grocery store in later years. But for the average person, meat was a rarity. Where they had to painstakingly hunt, and more times than not, come home empty-handed, or buy it with money they didn't have. The next day, early in the morning, we left the inn, to explore some more, and for me to find out what the plan was with the crusade. But there was a stop needed before anything. Coming out of a busy street, we got our first glimpse of a building that even in the 21st century would be a staple of Paris, just like the Eiffel Tower. Notre Dame. At the moment it was still under construction, and looked much smaller than I had remembered, but I had only ever seen it in photos, so what did I know? Maybe it will grow in later years. Later that day, when both boys were tired, I brought them back to their rooms and told them I would be gone for a little while, and not to leave their rooms for anything until I returned. Leaving the inn, I made sure to put my sword on, as I went, making sure all knew I was a warrior. From listening in on conversations as I passed, I learned that the army was stationed in the south side of the city, explaining why we never saw them. It took me another hour to get to the south side of the city, after going over 2 large bridges to get over the rivers that split the city in two. After that, the signs of an army became clearer. With more gruff-looking men with swords, starting to appear. Making it out of the walls of the city, the army camp was along the wall of the city. Hundreds or maybe 1,000 small white tents littered the area, looking like a small ocean. Making my way through the crowded camp, I looked for somewhere to sign my name, and join the army. After asking a few of the men, they pointed me in the direction of a large tent, with flags billowing around it. At the tent, was a large wooden desk, sat outside the entrance, with a monk seated with a large book that he scribbled in, as men gave their names to sign up. Going to the back of the line, I became bored quickly, and looked around as I waited. Thankfully the line moved quite quickly, and before I could get too bored and fall asleep standing, I was at the desk. Name? The monk asked in a nasally voice. Adam Gotts, I said, giving him a false last name. Do you know how to use a sword? He asked, not looking up as he wrote. Yes, I'm quite good with a sword. I said. And can you read? Yes, I can read. I can also write, and am proficient in mathematics, and languages. I said, giving the monk a smile as he finally raised his head, with a confused look on his face. You can? He asked, confused. Yes I can, I said with a smirk. Quickly grabbing another book that was on the desk, he flipped it open, and turned it towards me. Read this out loud. He said, with a furrowed brow. Leaning over to get a better look, I read off the page quickly and without any errors. Once finished, the monk now had a surprised look on his face, as he stared at me. Then closing it, his mouth then the book, he turned the large book that was in front of him around then said, write your name on the bottom under the last one. Shrugging, I grabbed the quill he offered, and wrote my name, with all the fancy curves and smoothness I could. Once I was done, the monk turned the large book back to himself, and widened his eyes. Looking back up at me, he spoke again. Are you a noble? Nope, I said, and couldn't help but smile. I should have pretended to be slow, or at least a noble. I thought to myself as I went over the camp's books. After signing up with the monk, I was led to meet the general of the army, then promptly given the job of bookkeeper. And books they had. No less than 50 large books, of all the records. From what they spent on food, to what they were paying their men. All of it was held in these books. And what a mess it was. For one, they were completely being screwed by their food providers, and I mean who the fuck was stupid enough to pay 3 gold coin per cow? At this point in time, a healthy cow might cost you 2 or 3 silvers, not 3 gold. Then there were those pesky grain sellers, who were practically doing the exact same thing. They are going to run out of money soon if they don't change this. Somewhere after an hour I needed a break. So leaving the camp, I made my way back to the inn, where I found both Oliver and Gerard sitting at a table eating a plate of food with John and Henry. Grabbing an empty chair, I sat in an open space. Well, it looks like we will be joining the army camp by tomorrow, I said, as I waved at one of the servers to bring me a plate. As I was eating, an idea popped into my head. I could use my own company to help with this. I still had the shipping business, which was run by my Rome bank. But some time ago, one of the branch heads of that bank decided to expand on it, adding an on-land caravan department to it. We shipped food to cities and other locations that wasn't accessible by sea. Finishing my food, I quickly gave John and Henry instructions, about watching the boys, and making sure they went to bed at a reasonable time, before leaving the inn again. Leaving the inn, I made my way to the busy docks, even though it was getting dark. Walking down the full docks, I looked for the signs of one of my ships. After a few minutes I found it. The ship was a galley ship, and the biggest ship in the harbor. The reason I could tell it was one of mine, was a symbol painted into the head of the ship. The symbol was of a sun. With green and blue as the rays of light coming out of a red sun. Coming down to the gangplank, I stopped in front of a pair of my guards, who were in the fashion of old legionaries, with purple capes. Speaking in Latin, I told them. I must speak to your captain, I said sternly. Both men looked at each other surprised. The captain is not available at the moment, one of them said, but I cut him off. Go to your captain and tell him my words, he will understand the meaning. Nox mors est, sol vita est. Night is death, the sun is life/Old Latin. The guards looked at each other again, before one of them left, and knocked on a small cabin door at the back of the ship. After a moment he entered. While he was busy, me and the remaining guards stood awkwardly, while I rocked on my heels, making popping sounds with my lips. It only took a moment for the doors of the cabin to literally be kicked open, and a grey-bearded man fast walked to us. The man was probably in his late 40s, with long white hair, and a beard that would put Duck Dynasty to shame. He wore a white shirt that went to his knees with a piece of black rope as his belt, and fine sandals as his footwear. Practically skidding to a stop, the man looked at me wide-eyed before he dropped to his knees in front of me. "I have waited my whole life for this moment," he said, in what sounded like worship. Surprising me even more, the man hesitantly reached out and grabbed my feet. "What in the fuck?" I thought. Yeah, why don't you stand up? Hey, we're drawing some attention here," I said, looking around, at the people. "Your wish is my command," he said, before standing again. "What was that all about?" I asked, as he stood up. "Oh, I've always wanted to meet the Father. And to finally meet you here of all places is just a true blessing," he said, looking up to the darkening sky, raising his hands up. "Praise God," he said, and I could have sworn I saw a tear form in one of his eyes. "The Father?" I asked. Now way beyond confused. "Yes, Father," he said, confirming it for me. "Father of what?" I asked. "Father of man," he said with a wide smile. "Oh phew, okay." Raising a hand to my forehead, I let out a groan. "And how exactly did you come up with that?" I asked, not removing my hand from my face. "I'm a member of the Circle, Father," he said. "What is the Circle?" I asked. The man raised an eyebrow as he looked at me confused. "The Circle, it's a group who worship the Father of man, and that's you, Father," he said. I smacked my forehead again. "And who exactly is part of this group?" I asked. "Oh, well, all the heads of each bank, of course. As well as the heads of each department. Like myself. I'm the head of the ocean trading sector. I thought you would have known about this, Father," he said. I raised my hands. "Could you please stop calling me Father?" "Oh, yes, I mean sir," he said with a chuckle. "This can't be happening," I thought as I started to pace in front of them. "These idiots made a fucking cult about me," I thought while shaking my head. Finally coming to a stop, I spoke to the captain of the ship. "Prepare your ship to sail, I will be back in an hour, then we will be heading to Rome," I said, before turning to leave. I was a bit pissed. I was actually starting to look forward to being a soldier for a while. But now, thanks to my bank head, I'm having to leave and deal with this issue that they hid from me for who knows how long. Technically I didn't need to leave. But the idea of a group of people worshipping me just creeped me out to no end. So I decided to just nip this in the rear as soon as possible. And plus it wasn't like there was going to be way more wars soon. So I had time. 100 Years' War and more. Making it back to the inn, I woke both John and Henry and told them to pack theirs and my belongings. After that, I went upstairs to Gerard and Oliver's room, waking them as well, telling them to get dressed. Then went to my room, putting my things in one of the chests that they were brought up in. In total, it took us a little under 30 minutes to get moving towards the docks. Guiding them through the streets, we made it to the ship just in time. "What's going on, Adam?" Henry asked, as some of the ship's men started to take our belongings to the ship. "Something has come up, we're going to Rome," was all I said, as I helped the boys from the back of the cart. Once the cart was empty, I was asked what I wanted done with the horse and cart. Looking around the dock for a moment, I spotted a man who was missing an arm and seemed to be down on his luck. He looked to have probably been a soldier or guard at some point, if his steady stance told me anything, but sadly he lost his arm at some point. Pulling the horse along, I stopped in front of him. "Want a horse?" I asked him simply. The man looked at me, then the horse, and back to me. "Where'd you steal it from?" he asked in a gruff voice. "I didn't, we're leaving for Rome and don't have enough space on board to take him with me. He's a good horse and in good health," I said. The guy gave a shrug, so I handed the horse over to the man before boarding the ship. Entering the ship, I made my way to the back, where the boys, Henry and John, were sitting. underscore 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 underscore. The trip took nearly a week, which was annoying, because all I wanted to do was yell at some bankhead the entire time. But there was a good thing during the trip. I found out more about this circle group. First I was told what the circle meant. I was shown by the captain, who I found out was named Anton, the symbol for the group. The symbol was a collection of circles. One big one, with 4 small ones inside in another circle, and what they represented. One unity and wholeness, representing completeness and perfection. It has no beginning or end, meaning an eternal and infinite nature. Was the first big circle that surrounded the other 4 smaller ones. 2. Continuity and infinity. The circle's endless shape symbolizes continuity and infinity, as it has no breaks or interruptions. It can represent the cyclical of life, seasons, and the ongoing flow of time. 3. Harmony and balance. The symmetrical nature of a circle symbolizes harmony and balance. It represents a sense of equilibrium and equilibrium in various aspects, such as emotions, relationships, and the natural world. 4. Divine and spiritual. The circle represents the divine and spiritual realms. It can symbolize the divine presence, enlightenment, and the interconnectedness of all things. Like a halo. 5. Protection. Represents a sacred space, and a gathering, that is protected. And I couldn't help but give a silent nod of respect to whoever came up with all of that, because damn, that was a lot of shit that kinda made sense. Apparently they had 2 meetings a year in the Rome Bank. Once at the beginning of the year, and once in the 6th month of the year. Involving all the bank heads, and the heads of each branch. There were also a lot of other things I learned, but after I found out they didn't do any weird stuff like sacrifices or group sex nights, I felt a bit better, but of course still pissed. By the time we reached Rome's large harbor, I had started to get some hair back on my head. So instead of being bald, I now had a buzz cut look. But that didn't really matter much, especially here in Rome, where the Pope resides. Every person from the lowest of class to the richest, were true believers in faith, and have gone to church every Sunday. So if I was to show my white hair here, it wouldn't take long for people to start having ideas. Using a hooded cloak, I made my way to the bank. As I traveled the once familiar streets, I slowly started to realize how much of this place had changed in the past few hundred years that I had been gone. Of course there are still some things that remain the same. Like the Colosseum, my horse racing arena, or the baths of Caracalla. Finally making it to the large steel doors of my bank, I looked up at the absolutely massive marble structure that surrounded them. What the fuck, I said out loud. The structure was a true behemoth, of about 4 stories, with massive white marble pillars, and taking up nearly a quarter of a mile from one end to the other. Rome isn't even the main bank, why the hell is this bank so big? I thought, as I looked around. Deciding to get this done with, I made my way inside. The inside was just as grand as the outside, with massive pillars that led you to the desks of the tellers. As I walked, I saw that the marble pillars had carvings in them, depicting scenes of historical events. Like certain battles, or of emperors taking the throne. But one stole my attention. On one of the pillars, was an almost perfect carving of my face, with long hair and all. I'm gonna dig up one of my old bank heads, and kill him again. I grumbled to myself as I walked up to one of the opened desks. Good afternoon, sir, may I have your vault's name, number, and its security numbers, sir? A young man said, giving me a smile. I stood stone-faced as I took out my beat-up and dinged gold card, and tossed it onto his desk. Your bank head, now. The young man looked confused for a moment before he looked down at the card and froze. Surprising me, the young man opened one of the drawers of his desk and pulled out a slip of paper. On the paper was the symbol that was on my card, then some scribbling underneath. His eyes got even bigger as he read the paper. Yeah, yes, SSIR. He squeaked, as he stood, and literally ran for his life to the back of the large open bank area, to a door at the far back, where he slammed into it before disappearing into the back. The actions of the clerk drew much attention, leaving me to stand there, as people stared at me. After a few minutes the clerk exited the door, closely followed by another man, who was dressed in much finer clothing, and had rings and chains on his, signifying his status. As he walked towards me, we met eyes, and I instantly knew that he knew that I knew. I couldn't help myself. A cold sweat appeared on his face as I stared him down as he got closer. Chapter 69, What It All Means. As it turned out, the bankhead's name was Alexius Antonius. He was a taller man of this time of about 5,10, with swept-back black hair, brown eyes, and light olive skin, with a lean build. He was maybe in his late 30s, and was the successor of his father. Meaning he was raised to be a head of this bank from birth. Which was fine with me. I didn't care who the bank heads appointed as their successors, just as long as they did their jobs correctly, and didn't take from the honeypot. Hello sir. Alexius stammered, as he avoided my eyesight. Take me to your office. I said simply. Turning sharply, Alexius guided me through the massive building, until we were on one end of the large building, on the top floor. Entering large steel doors, I was met with what I could only describe as an exorbitant amount of wealth. The office was at least 300 feet long, and 50 feet wide, with a ceiling about 40 feet up, with a number of pillars leading to the end, where I could see a large opulent wooden desk, with an open balcony behind it, that let in fresh air. The pillars were marble, and had solid gold rings surrounding them, covering the cracks, to make them look like one solid pillar. As we walked to the end, I looked at the large stone carvings that covered the walls, as well as the tapestries. Finally at the end, we stopped in front of his desk, where two comfortable-looking chairs sat. Turning to look at me, Alexius spoke first. Would you like any refreshments? No, I'm all right. I said. Alexius gulped as I took a seat in one of the chairs without asking, and finally lowering my hood, to show the white stubble on my head. Why don't you take a seat, Alexius? I said, gesturing to the open chair. Quickly he sat, and perched himself on the edge, looking like a child about to be scolded by their parents. So, the circle? I asked, looking him in his eyes, which widened slightly. I'm sure he had been trained in keeping his facial features calm in situations like this, but the subtle twitches, and perspiration that started to cover him were all the signs I needed. Ah, you found out about that? He asked sheepishly. So all of you were trying to hide it from me? I asked, raising one of my brows. Well, not exactly farther. He said, raising his hands. That was never the founder's intentions. He continued before I could tell him not to call me father. The founders? I asked. Yes, the original bank heads. Very nearly 1,000 years ago, all of the bank heads came together to make the circle, here in Rome. He said, pointing down at the ground. And what exactly do all of you do? Because I'm a bit confused as to it all. Alexius chuckled. It would probably be best if I showed you. He said, standing to his feet. Following his lead, we walked to one of the nearby pillars. Raising his hand to one of the gold bands that circled the pillar. Alexius moved the band to the side until there was a solid clunk that filled the room. Followed by the sound of stone on stone. Turning in the direction of the sound, which was about 5 feet in front of the desk, I turned to see that a staircase was forming into the ground, as the slabs of marble that once looked sturdy, lowered down to make steps. Geez, they even have a cool secret entrance. I thought, as we started walking towards the stairs. Entering the stairs, I saw that it was already lit. These stairs will take us right to the Hall of Records. Alexius said, as we descended. The Hall of Records? I asked. It is where we keep all of the records of the circle and you, father. He said. Could you stop calling me father? I said, as I ducked a torch. I'm not much for it. As you command. Alexius said, not breaking his stride. To my amazement, it took us nearly 20 minutes of continuously going down the stairs at a good pace to finally reach the bottom. Once we were out of the staircase, Alexius had to take a moment to catch his breath. That is why we only have 2 meetings a year. This trip can be hard on some of our older members. He said with a pant. Looking around, I was greeted by the sight of a pair of absolutely behemoth gold doors, that were no less than 30 feet high. I stared open-mouthed at the sight. Are those made of real gold? I asked. Alexius nodded, finally able to breathe normally again. Yes, they were built here in our own foundries. And how did you get them all the way down here? I asked. Alexius smiled. These doors were commissioned by the third head of the Rome Bank, when we were expanding the vaults to deeper levels. When construction was underway, a large cavern was discovered, which was turned into the Hall of Records. He said, walking to the gold doors and laying a hand on it. The opening was big enough for us to get the doors through, then set upright. Can it open? I asked, as I pushed on the door. No, they are too heavy. And are not meant to, they are meant to be symbolic. He said, while pointing past me, to what looked to be 3 large plagues. In multiple languages, like Sanskrit, for the bankhead in India. Then there was Arabic, for the bankhead from the Middle East. Then lastly there was one in Latin, which the bankheads from England, Rome, and Alexandria could all read. Reading the Latin one, I was a bit amazed at what it said. Gold doors, gleaming with unattainable beauty, stand as reminders of the tantalizing desires that remain out of our grasp. They beckon, yet remain forever closed, serving as symbols of the untouchable dreams and opportunities that challenge us to seek new paths and unlock the hidden treasures within ourselves. Then underneath that were more words. Success and achievements. These golden doors can symbolize the rewards of hard work and success, the achievement of goals, reaching a high level of accomplishment, and the fulfillment of dreams. Opportunity and abundance. These golden doors can signify opportunities and abundance that await you behind them. Prosperity, wealth, and favorable circumstances. A gateway to new opportunities and experiences. Transformation and enlightenment. Gold is considered a symbol of transformation and enlightenment. These golden doors may represent a passage or gateway to personal growth, spiritual enlightenment, and self-discovery. Or signify a transformative journey or a new phase in life. The hidden or valuable knowledge. These golden doors may also symbolize hidden or valuable knowledge that lies behind it. And the pursuit of wisdom, education, or the discovery of profound truths. Then at the very bottom was one more thing that I read out loud. In a world consumed by greed and overshadowed by darkness, let us embark on a different path, guided by the light of wisdom and knowledge. As we navigate through the complexities of life, may we resist the allure of selfish desires and instead, strive to cultivate our minds and souls. Let us honor the legacy of our blood father, who walks the path of righteousness, and embrace the responsibility to follow in his footsteps. By choosing wisdom over greed, and good over evil, we can shape a future that is defined by compassion, justice, and the triumph of the human spirit. I was a bit stunned. This was a lot more than I had originally thought it would be. What I had imagined was a bunch of cloak-wearing crazies, sacrificing goats to a massive altar of me. But from what I just read, these guys pursue knowledge, and the balancing of the spirit, as well as to strive for justice and peace. Turning back to Alexius, I raised an eyebrow. So how do we get in? I asked. Ready to see what was inside. Apparently the way we would get in was a sort of test of the mind, where you had to find a way to open a secret passage. At least that's what it was for new members. But Alexius didn't bother putting me through it, and instead walked to the 3 large plagues. And pressed down on certain words on each one. The hidden, he said, pressing that word on the Latin plaque. Enlightenment. He said, pressing the other plaque that was in Sanskrit. Then at the bottom of the plaque in Arabic. He pressed. Of the human spirit. As the words left his mouth, a rumble started. Turning, I saw the stairs we had come from rise back up, to reveal a tunnel. Sneaky. I said with a chuckle. Wait, so there is nothing behind those doors? I asked, pointing over my shoulder at the massive gold doors. Or is this tunnel just taking us around it to the other side? He shook his head. No, just rock. This tunnel will take us in the other direction. I couldn't help but let out a laugh as we started to walk down the tunnel. The tunnel was carved out of the solid stone, and looked to go on forever. I'm really starting to understand why there are only 2 meetings a year. This is turning into a whole side quest of its own. I thought to myself. Finally making it out of the tunnel after only a handful of minutes and a left turn. We entered a large room. The cavern, I said, as I looked into the large open space that seemed to go on forever. We had come out of the cave about 50 feet up on a ledge that zigzagged down to the ground. And from where I stood at the top, I could see hundreds of shelves that held leather-bound books, and scrolls shoved into them all. All around the hundreds of lined-up shelves, were large stone bowls that were carved from the earth with oil fires burning from them, being the only fires needed to cover the shelved area. But further out, the light didn't reach, making it look like the shelves were an island in a black void. And what are all of these texts of? I asked, turning to look at Alexius. Medicine, languages, and anything we could get our hands on. He said, with a smile. As well as some about you, he added. Of me? I asked, tapping my chest. There are stories about me. He nodded. Yes, there are. Would you like to see them? He asked. Lead the way. It only took us a few minutes to get to the bottom of the stairs, and into the bookshelves. Finally making it to the center of the bookshelves, there was an opening where a large round table sat, but something else caught my attention instantly. "What is that?" I asked as I came to a dead stop. Turning to look at what I pointed at, Alexius spoke. "That is you," Alexius said. "I can see that, but what I'm asking is why there is a 15-foot marble statue of me in the center of this room." "Well, you are the reason for all of this. Our guiding light," he said, his voice taking on that hint of worship. Long story short, there were stories about me written from long-gone bankheads who had met me, as well as stories from scholars who had encountered me on my travels. Some of them were thousands of years old. For hours I went through each and every one of them one after the other, as Alexius kept handing me more. And to be honest, I couldn't really remember much of them. Sure, I was smart and had a pretty good memory, far beyond a regular person, but there is also a limit to it. That's why I had a very private journal that I kept hidden from even Jane and Julius, with things I needed to know about in later years, like the whole plot of the world I'm in, the name of certain characters, and all that. Along with everything else I knew about the 21st century. By the time I finished reading all the stories they had about me, I started to realize why this group that had formed around me were the way they were. To them I was the first man, created by God. In the stories I was shown as an immortal person that sought justice, like when I ended up dealing with a number of the corrupt businessmen in Rome, even though I was using corrupt officials in Rome, to get rid of my competitors so I could make more money. But they didn't know about that. The story they had only showed the outside story that was created to cover up the real reason. Or that I was someone that sought knowledge. Because I was seen stealing a bunch of scrolls from the Library of Alexandria when it was burning to the ground. Even though I had taken them to add to my own collection of items, and saw it as a waste to just let them burn. Once I was done reading, we slowly made our way back, and out of the underground library. I didn't say a word the entire time, being too caught up in my thoughts. They actually believed me to be the person they wrote about. A good person, I thought. Finally exiting the stairs that led us back to the office, Alexius reclosed the stairs as I took a seat. For a few more minutes I didn't say anything, and instead, I continued to think. Why should I care what they believe in or use to better themselves? So making my mind up, I gave the approval to Alexius that he could continue all of this, but I made sure to leave him with a warning. When I came here today, I didn't know if I was going to kill you or not. I said, pausing, to let that float in the air for a moment. Then the rest who were involved in all of this. I finished. I saw Alexius gulp. But, from what I have seen here, I couldn't be happier. I said, instantly seeing the relief of Alexius's face. I kind of felt bad for them. They were using me as someone to follow in pursuits I myself never followed. I never had a problem bribing a corrupt person to get what I wanted. Or killing someone. I wasn't a wise old man who gave advice about the cosmos. I was just like any other person. But this group of people use me as a figurehead, and a person to follow to better themselves. So who was I to get in their way of something they had apparently been doing for 1,000 years? Just as long as they didn't start doing any of that weird crap, I was fine with their little book club. Underscore 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 underscore. Whoa, that's 3 in 3 days, what's going on here? I decided to end this one here so I can start on the skips in the next chapter. And thank you all for the support you have all shown. It truly means a lot to me. Bean. Oh, and I nearly forgot to add this. Please check out some of my other works. They are pretty good if I must say so myself. Enjoy. Chapter 70, New Adventures and Sad Endings. Making it back to the ship, I collected Oliver and Gerard. I found them in the small cabin that had belonged to the captain of the ship, Anton, before he loaned it to us for the trip. It was big enough for them to add another 2 hammocks for me and one of the boys. They were currently sitting on the ground playing with some of the toys I had gotten for them in Paris. I asked if they wanted to do a little more exploring of a new city. And of course they said yes. Leaving the ship, I made sure to bring both John and Henry so they could carry anything we had bought. It was good to be back in my old stomping grounds. It had changed so much that this was like a whole new experience for me, just like it was for the others. We ended up buying more clothes for myself and the boys. I got new tunics as well as a new black cape that had a nice hood to cover my head while in the most concentrated place of religion in all of Europe. You couldn't be too careful. We visited everywhere that interested us. And as we went, I noticed that we were being followed by a group of my bank's guards. They stayed at a distance, but stood out like a kangaroo in a tuxedo. With their black legionary armor and purple cloaks, they drew the most attention. My guess was Alexius sent them out to watch out for us. We ended up spending nearly a month in Rome itself, exploring, and just relaxing. While we were there, I also made a few paintings of the place, making sure to make it as realistic as my abilities to paint would allow. Because who knew, maybe historians would love to know what ancient Rome looked like fully instead of guessing. After that, I decided to continue our little expedition, and went east. Using the same ship again, we went east to Egypt. This change of climate was hard on everyone, but after a few days, and a couple of tips from me on how to stay cool, they started to improve. I made sure both Oliver and Gerard had the best clothes for the weather, and showed them how to wrap their head scarves, if they wanted to cover their faces from the wind and sand. Again we shopped and bought anything that caught our attention. I also spent a few days painting Egypt and what remained of the pyramids. After that, I decided we would go across land to Baghdad, which was the center of everything that was happening in the Middle East at the moment. By now it had already been nearly 2 years, and both Oliver and Gerard were growing. It truly amazed me how much kids grow in such a short time. Not even 10 years old, Gerard was nearly 5 foot, while his younger brother Oliver wasn't far behind. Both boys were like sponges, taking in the world around them. From languages, to cultures, and different climates, like fish to water. They could now speak with John and Henry, after many nights by the fires, as I taught them the languages they wanted to learn. I had also shown them how to fight. At first I showed them moves with the pair of daggers I had gotten for each of them to carry. And as they grew bigger and stronger, I also showed them hand-to-hand, which they showed to be naturally skilled in. Baghdad was a blast, where the boys truly found their love for exploration. Many times I would let them run free in the streets. But I did tell them if they were ever in trouble, go to the large Gringotts bank I had in Baghdad, and to show them the gold cards I had given to each boy, and they would know what to do. There was only ever one problem. Some street thugs saw them spending a good deal of gold, so they thought it would be a good idea to try and rob both Oliver and Gerard. Long story short, both boys went to town on them, incapacitating 7 grown men without needing to kill any. Their smaller size helped them do so. As it turned out, that group of men were bribing the area's guards to let them do what they wanted. And as the guards saw what they did, the guards ended up chasing both Oliver and Gerard through the streets, all the way to the bank. But both Oliver and Gerard are quite nimble, and beat the guards there easily. Both boys ran up showing the bank guards the gold cards with my symbol on it. And since all guards at all my banks come from and are trained at my Rome bank, they knew well what that symbol meant. It ended up in a long standoff with the guards of the city. The only problem was that the Baghdad bank, being the central gold holder for practically the entire Middle East, had a lot of guards, and I mean a small army of very well trained men. 8,000 to be exact. When I showed up, I was pretty amazed when I saw the standoff. In front of my bank was every one of my bank's guards in their gleaming black legionary armor and helmets, with large black shields in front of them, making a long wall, with their purple capes fluttering in the wind. While all of the city's guards, known as the Mamluks, who were slaves and soldiers that were loyal to the caliphate, numbered around 10,000. They stood about 50 feet from each other. But without all the armor, or shields, and with crappy-looking swords. As it turned out, those thugs were a part of a much larger organization that was bribing a good number of the city's guards. And as soon as the corrupt guards were threatened by my guards, they called some of their buddies, who were also corrupt, who then called the rest of the guards that weren't. Everything was so jumbled at the time, that by the time the majority of guards that weren't corrupt got there, nobody knew what was happening, and assumed something bad had happened between the city's rulers and the bank, causing the standoff to ensue. The standoff only ended when Baghdad's leadership had to get involved, telling their men to stand down. They sent 10 large chests of gold as an apology. They did that because they knew my bank was the only reason Baghdad made so much money, and if we were to leave, its money would dry up quicker than a drop of water in the desert. As a result of all of this, they ended up sending their most loyal guards to investigate the issues. And let's just say, the city was short on guards for a while, as nearly a quarter of them were hanging from the city's walls. When they investigated the crime ring that was bribing the guards, it wasn't hard for them to find them. Mainly because I left the 300 heads of all its members in the center of their city in the most populated area for all to see. I ended up splitting the chests of gold that was given to the bank, to both Oliver and Gerard, opening up an account for them. So now both of them were richer than most nobles in their own right. We continued our journey a few months later, heading to India. We ended up staying in India for 3 years, experiencing its rich culture. The main reason why we stayed so long was because I decided it was about time to start expanding my banks some more. I sent a message by ship to Alexius in Rome to get everything started. It took 2 months to get a response, and that response was of a delegation to be sent to every ruler in India. Not for there to be a bank in each of their lands, but for the delegations to find out who would be the best rulers we can trust enough for us to place our bank in their lands. It took nearly a year for the delegations to get together again, and the ones to come out on top was the Delhi Sultanate. I left the whole planning thing to the delegations, and headed our own way. We decided not to continue east, as I got word of the Mongols causing some trouble. So we started making our way back to England. Of course we didn't just take a boat back. Instead we went by land, going from city to city or town to town. By the time we passed through France again to take a boat across, we had 4 carts with horses pulling them. I guided one John and Henry with one each, and Oliver and Gerard together on one. It had been almost 10 years now, and both boys were practically adults. Gerard trying to grow a beard, but all he could manage was a patchy stubble at 18. And Oliver who had developed a love for the arts and knowledge. We got a ship to take us across to England. I wore a cloak to cover my now fully regrown hair, as we stepped from a full ship. "Why is it so cloudy?" Gerard asked as he looked up at the sky. "Get used to it, it's always cloudy here," I said with a smile, as I looked around the familiar area. It took the whole day for all of our stuff to be unloaded from the ship. So to pass the time, we walked the streets of London. With its ramshackle buildings that looked ready to fall with the slightest gust of wind, and its winding roads that smelled of shit. I couldn't have been happier to finally be back. "So this is where you come from?" Oliver asked from behind me, as I led us. "Kind of. I never really had a home, I was always moving from one place to the other. But I have spent more years here than anywhere else, so I guess it is," I said, sidestepping a passed-out drunk man. "And why here? There are many other places that would be more favorable," Oliver asked. I chuckled. "You might not be able to see it now, but one day this place will rival all the others." I hadn't told them of my immortality, and I wasn't sure if I would. Thankfully neither John or Henry had spilled the beans about that. Probably because we hadn't spoken of it since that night in the forest, all those years ago, so it was deep in their minds, buried under all the memories of the traveling we had done. But I knew it would only be a matter of time before I wouldn't have a choice. And besides, I did build a house here, so technically this is my home for the day that I'm too tired of all the traveling, and only think of relaxation. "You have a home?" Gerard asked with a chuckle. "Yes, I have a home. I built it with my own hands," I said, turning to give him a look. Neither of them knew too much about me, other than the fact that I was a traveler with seemingly unlimited money, and had close relations with the scattered Gringotts banks. "It will be a tight fit for all of us, with a friend of mine and his wife who stay there. He stayed here to watch over the house and to deal with some business here for me. But it won't be too bad, we have slept in much worse, and we can add on an extra room to the house for the both of you," I said, coming to a stop to let a pair of men who were in a fight pass by. "It might be nice to settle down for a while," Oliver said. Maybe," Gerard said, as he turned to look into a bakery that had an enticing smell wafting from its door. Early the next morning, we pulled our carts of stuff out of the walls of London, and I started to head home. It didn't take me long to figure out something was different. Walking down the dirt road, I saw that the small trail that had once led to my home had been widened. And from the look of it, well used. Turning down the road, we walked down it and took the left turn, which should have revealed my small stone home. Instead it showed nothing but more fucking road. I came to a stop for a moment as I stared at the spot where my home should have sat. But instead there was nothing but a road. Even my beech tree was gone. What the fuck? I thought. Moving down the road some more, surprised at how much longer it was. 20 minutes later, I found out why the road was so long now. Coming out of some trees that were on both sides of the road, I got my first glimpse of a massive castle. "That little shit!" I shouted as I saw it. "He built a fucking castle and demolished the home I had built with my own 2 hands." I continued, as I picked up the pace, so I could give a 1,000-year-old man-child an earful of my rage. Making it to the large wooden door that was open. I was stopped by a pair of guards. "Move out of my way, or I'm going to throw the both of you out of it," I said, with a snarl. "Ha, yeah right," the one to my left said. "Nobody is to enter without the Lord's permission." The one to my right added. "Oh really?" I said, now washing my face of anger, and spreading a wide smile across my face. "Let it be that way then," I said. Before either of them knew what was happening, I smashed their heads together. Not hard enough to kill them, but to give them one hell of a migraine, when they woke. Leaving the carts behind, I strode through the courtyard of the stone castle, until I made it to another pair of large wooden doors. Restricting my strength, I pushed the doors open, letting them slam into the walls as I strode in. "Julius, get down here now!" I roared, knowing that no matter where he was in the cast, he could hear me. It only took 2 seconds for me to hear the flutter of cloth, as Julius blurred into the large reception room. "Ah, Adam, you're back," Julius said, with a wide smile, as he came in for a hug. But our reunion was short-lived. Because as soon as he was in range, I swung, landing a solid punch to the left side of his face, sending him flying backwards, and into a stone pillar. "You destroyed my home, and built this," I said, striding forward. Wait. Julius managed to get out. "We didn't have a choice, the building collapsed right on top of us." Julius got out in a panicked rush. I posed. "It what?" I asked. "The beech tree died some time ago. And during a bad storm it was knocked over and landed right on the house," Julius again said quickly. I stared at him for a solid minute, before the sounds of rushing feet could be heard. Coming from behind me, with their swords drawn, were Oliver and Gerard ready for a fight. "Adam, are you all right?" Gerard asked, as they came into the room. Taking a deep inhaled breath, I turned to look at them. "Yes, I'm fine. It just seemed some people here had forgotten about me. But there is good news, you will each have your own rooms." I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little upset. That place had been my home for literally almost 1,000 years, and to find out that it was gone was like a kick to the sack. But I also had to admit that the place had been falling apart when I had left, and there was only so much longer it could have held together. The introductions were pleasant, especially when Jane returned from a hunt. The look of shock on their faces when she walked in was priceless, and never before had I wished for a camera. It took me a while to become accustomed to living in the castle. With more rooms than we would ever need, I started to feel that lonely feeling again, as I would walk down empty halls. But then that started to change. Gerard of all people took a liking to one of the maids of the castle. Her name was Isabel, and was a blonde woman, of larger proportions than was common to this era. In the 21st century, she would be considered triangular. Or in other words, bottom-heavy. A very pretty woman. Before I knew what was happening, I was sitting in a church as they got married. Not even a few months later, his wife was pregnant. And to all of our surprise, they had a pair of daughters. Not much later, Oliver brought back a girl he had been courting for a few months. Her name was Emma. A short brunette with coal-black eyes and a skinny figure. And just like Gerard, they were also married. And having kids shortly after. Both by the age of 20, which was quite old to be getting married at this time. Commonly 13 to 15 was the average. Now a few years later, our castle was bustling with life and activities as small children seemed to be everywhere, as both Isabel and Emma just seemed to be having children one after the other. The best part of it all was that they all called me Grandpa. Which was funny, because both Gerard and Oliver were starting to look older than me, while I looked to be no older than a teenager myself. Gerard and Oliver hadn't asked me about it yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they did so. And like I thought they would, they did ask. They asked me why neither myself or Julius and Jane never seemed to age. So I had the talk with them, the whole I'm the Adam talk. Which they took quite well, and apparently had kinda guessed, which surprised me a bit. But they told me that in all of their travels with me, they had never seen anyone else with white hair. And after coming to the castle they had finally had the chance to read the Bible themselves and put the pieces together. But Jane and Julius were a different story altogether, and was harder for me to explain. So I had Julius help me. We showed them the pros and cons of becoming a vampire, like immortality and the powers that came with it. They sat and didn't ask any questions and just let us explain. At the end of it all, I asked them the important question. Did they want to become one? Neither said anything for a while before Oliver asked the first question. What happens to the soul when you become one of these vampires? He asked. I thought for a moment, then shrugged. We don't know. I said. For all I know it's perfectly fine, and nothing happens to it. Or I could be wrong, but I can't see them, so who knows. It took them a few days to make their decisions. And it was to stay human. They didn't want to risk their souls. I was sad when they told me that. I had become more connected to them than anyone I had ever before. And now I knew that one day, they would be gone. So I decided to spend as much time with them as I possibly could. And I did. We would go on the occasional adventures. Sometimes we would go north to the lands of the Scots, or every now and again, wives permitting, would go across the pond to France. But there is only so long in a mortal life, and at the age of 68, Oliver was the first to go. He went in his sleep, never knowing he was passing on. He was buried in a large tomb I had constructed within the castle's church. The tomb was large enough to hold 10 generations of their children. Something special that happened when they were alive was take on my last name Grey. Being born as peasantry they never had one, so they decided to take my own. So the tomb became known as the Tomb of the Greys. The time after Oliver's passing was hard on us. Even Julius and Jane. But me in particular. I felt a numbness that seemed to take the light from my eyes. And not long after his brother, Gerard also passed at 74 years. He was buried with his brother in the tomb. By now their children already had children and families themselves, and farms to run that I had bought for them, so I didn't get to see them much anymore. It was probably best that way anyhow. I was sure they knew who I really was to the world, but that didn't seem to matter to them. To them I was just Grandpa. Henry and John had died many years ago, after living out the remaining 30 years of their lives as rich men, in large homes. And from what I heard, surrounded by many women. Sucks for them, that in both of their wills, I had all of their money donated to churches and orphanages, since neither of them had kids, or were actually close to any of their mistresses. But now without much left for me here, I left again. With no destination, or an idea in hell of what I was going to do. Just that I needed time to heal. And I couldn't do that in a place that reminded me of my adopted children at every turn. Chapter 71, Moving Forward and New Guy. I left the castle. I didn't tell Julius or Jane. In fact I didn't even take any of my belongings. Not my sword clothes or money. It was as if I had just disappeared without a trace. I didn't have a destination in mind, or a goal I wanted like I normally did before. Now I decided to just go. I started by going north to the land of the Scots, and after a small boat ride I made it to Ireland, where I spent some time by their sheer rocky cliffs. Not that I wanted to jump, but I found the strong gusts of wind there relaxing. I don't know when it happened, but I started to look like a beggar somewhere along my travels. With my torn clothes and my dirty appearance, I couldn't blame other dirty people from staring at me like I was a crazy person. Either way, I didn't care much, and continued my pointless journey. I'm not sure how long I walked. Maybe a decade or so, long enough to reach China then Egypt on foot. By then I might as well have been a wandering hobo with a stick and a small pouch at the end with my belongings. Except I didn't have a stick or belongings. Being back in Egypt got my mind back on Oliver and Gerard, which was a topic I normally tried to avoid. But I couldn't help but think. Would they want me to mourn their loss like this? To wander the earth with no point? No, they wouldn't. To die was their choice. But why did it have to hurt so bad? From that day forward, I changed. Gone was the wandering hobo. I wasn't quite ready to go back to England just yet, so I settled in Paris. As I soon found out, I had been wandering a lot longer than I had originally thought. As in 156 years. So in 1456, I opened a shop in Paris, France. But not just any shop, it was a printing shop. In the far back of the 2-story building, were 2 massive printing presses. It wasn't hard to employ a skilled group of employees to work here. The only real issue was finding someone who could read, that wasn't a monk, noble, or shaller, who would be willing to work in a printing house. I found that person was to be a teacher, who left his job, to come work for me. His job was to deal with the spelling of anything we needed to press. At first business was slow, and we didn't have any work for a while. But at the time, the 100 Years' War was still raging on, and a political man decided to employ us to make pamphlets for him that he would be handing out at one of his little high-class parties. The panelists were a bit of a joke to me, because the pamphlets were directed at England, calling them barbarians, and all sorts of things, to make people believe England was full of a bunch of inbreds. And if they were willing to make donations to support the war. Although I knew otherwise, about England. Business is business. What I did differently than any of the other few printers in Paris, was I added my artistic flair to them. Using a brush, I turned a dry piece of paper into an illuminated manuscript. With my hundreds of years of art experience, I could finish each one in less than 3 minutes. Then on the very bottom on the back of each pamphlet, I would press a stamp that had the company name on it. The Paris Press. Apparently the pamphlets were a hit. And before I knew what was happening, my company was being swamped with orders. So much so, that I had to hire an extra shift, to work through the nights. Which meant I had to hire another person who could spell. It also meant I needed to hire someone who was good at art, to keep me from doing all the artwork. Which was surprisingly easy. It seemed no matter the era, there were always struggling artists looking for work. We were also commissioned to press books as well. Bibles were the most common, while every now and again it would be something different. The real money makers were the books, where I could make a great profit. I ended up opening another 2 press shops in Paris alone. So deciding to spread out some more, I went to the second most populated place that wasn't months away. Rome. But before leaving I made sure to change my appearance. The last thing I needed was for my bank or the Volturi to find out I was there, and it would also help me avoid the gaze of the church. I cut my hair moderately short, and made a hair dye from some henna powder I had gotten my hands on. Which turned my hair into a reddish brown. In 1471, using the great amount of money I had earned in Paris, I opened a small building by the docks that used to be a warehouse, and turned it into a small printing factory, where we could do multiple orders at the same time. It took a bit of time to get the printing presses into place and working. But that gave me the time I needed to find the skilled people I needed. It wasn't hard to find those who could read and write, and it certainly wasn't hard to find those who were good at art. All I had to do for that, was to post flyers all over Rome asking any skilled artists looking for a job to show up, and I would test them. I also had it spread by word of mouth, just for some extra assurance. And like I had thought, Rome was packed full of artisans. By the next day, there was a line of young folks waiting by the doors. All I needed was 20 of them, so I decided to thin the crop and pick the best. One by one I had them come inside and tested them. Asking them to do simple things, then I would start to make it harder and harder. Most of them were truly skilled, but that didn't matter to me. If you couldn't do the hard pieces I give you to do, you weren't worth what I would be paying you, which was more than most in this city would be making. By the time it was dark, I had ended up with more artists than I had originally needed, but why not a few more for safety? When I was closing up shop and putting out the candles that were scattered around the building, a hard knock banged on the front door. Making my way there, whoever was on the other side banged a few more times. Reaching the door I swung it open and dodged a fist that was meant for the door I had just opened. Startled, I stepped back, and was glad I had stopped myself from automatically going on the attack. Because the young man on the other side looked absolutely horrified at the avoided accident. "My apologies," he practically yelled. I raised my hands. "It's all right, no harm done," I said with a chuckle. I watched as the young man let out a sigh of relief. "So what can I help you with at such a late hour?" I asked, leaning on the door frame. "Ah yes," the young man said, as he pulled a bag that was slung at his side open, and pulled out one of the flyers I had posted around the city and showed me. "I am here for the job." Well, sorry to tell you, but all of the positions have been filled." "Sorry about that," I said with a shrug. "Please, I can show you my abilities if you can just get the owner of the shop. I can show him my skills are more than enough for this position," the young man said in a panic. "I just got here from Vinci, and could really use this job," he said, sounding even more panicked. I wasn't offended that he didn't think I was the owner of the shop. That had been happening all day long, with grown adults yelling at me to get my boss because I didn't want to hire them, all because their abilities weren't up to par. I crossed my arms. "So you think you're that good, huh?" I asked. "I do," the young man said with surprising confidence. I looked him up and down. The young man seemed to have come from an at least middle-class family, and was of good health with longish brown hair. "Right," I said, pushing myself away from the door. What's your name, and where might I be able to find you, just in case one of the others doesn't work out? The young man took a step forward. Ah yes, my name is Leonardo da Vinci, and I will be at the Greenways Inn, for at least a week. He said. But I didn't hear anything after da Vinci. Oh fuck, I thought, as I fought to keep my face from showing my shock. After a moment, I spoke again. Da Vinci, you say? He nodded. Why don't you come in? I think we might have a spot for you here after all. As it turned out, this was Da Vinci's first day in Rome as an aspiring artist. His main goal was to become a student under a master painter. But he still needed money to survive. Me and Da Vinci quickly struck up a friendship after I hired him to work for me. Our shared intelligence, and our abilities in art, helping it form naturally. Even though in later years he would be considered as one of the true greats of art, at the moment, he was truly far away from that title. So I decided to guide him. I wouldn't say I'm the greatest painter to ever live. But I'm pretty damn good. I taught him everything he could contain. Which wasn't any small amount, mind you. Shadows and lighting, to the best ways to hold a brush. For years I got to see firsthand, as I watched Da Vinci grow into the man who will be known for hundreds of years. But eventually, when Da Vinci was in his late 20s, he decided to go out on his own, and to become that man that the world would come to know. I wouldn't say I was sad at his departure. I knew his destiny was different than my own. But there was still that twinge of sadness that came with every loss in my life, but like usual, it didn't last for too long. And again, I was ambling alone with the flow of time, until I felt like going home once again. For a while I lived an average life. Not using my bank's power to give me any advantage, or financial benefits. But instead, making everything I did a challenge. Because an easy life to me is a pointless life where there is nothing to push you forward to take another step down the winding road of time. When I first came to this world, it was to see the world, my business in Rome, then my banks. Sure, I took a break for a while in England, and would occasionally go on small adventures. But I always had something I wanted to do. The problem is, I'm starting to run out of things to occupy me. My business was starting to run itself, and I would just be cooped up in my office all day while my employees would do all of the work. But that's when something came to my attention. News has returned that a new land has been found. It wasn't hard to solidify the truth of the situation. Because everyone and their old mothers had a different tale of what they believed was happening. Some didn't believe it was another continent, but that they had hallucinations of this new world. But by taking a quick trip to Spain, I found the Pinta and the Nina, which apparently were two of the 3 ships that had returned. Even though it had been a full week since their return, most of the crew were still drawing in alcohol at local taverns, telling their tall tales for free booze. And stories they did tell. It was easy to know when they were overly exaggerating certain parts, but as soon as Christopher Columbus was mentioned, I knew they had actually discovered a new land, and one I would love to return to. Read bottom of chapter for plan on the next chapter. Julius POV. Year 1640. Wrapping my cloak around my shoulders, I looked up at the moon's light, as I descended the steps of the Hampton Court Palace. It had been a long evening, of mingling, and political speeches, one after the other. And all I wanted now was to head home. But not before the 3-hour horse ride it would take to get there. The whole reason I was pulled so far into London, was because the throne wanted us to loan them exorbitant amounts of gold, to fund one venture after the other. But the rules were rules, and ones Adam made sure would never be broken. One of those was to never fund a monarchy. Which I tend to agree with. Most of them were too busy thinking of ways to get more power from each other, stabbing each other in the back, because they wanted more power. And besides, the taxes our bank pays them each year is more than enough. I'm starting to see why Adam got tired of this whole high life, as he called it. A servant brought my horse from the stables to me, saddled, and ready to go. I gave the boy a silver, and nimbly got on. At a steady pace, my mind was again overwhelmed with thoughts. Adam had been gone for a very long time now. More than he had ever been away. At first neither I nor Jane knew what happened to him. One day he was there, and the next he had disappeared without a trace to follow. He didn't even take his beloved sword. I had spread the word to all bank heads to be on the lookout for him, and if seen, don't bother him, just send word to me, so I would at least know where he is. I'm not naive enough to think his disappearance was just one of his adventures. No. This was something else, and it was almost certainly something to do with Gerard and Oliver. After their deaths he wasn't himself. So all I could do was hope he was doing okay, and would soon be back. Leaving the city proper, myself and my horse trotted along the long dark paths that would take me home. The ride was actually quite enjoyable, and allowed me to decompress from the night's shenanigans of the nobility, with the sounds of the nightlife filling my ears. But 3/4 into my journey, my peaceful tranquility was broken by the sound of rushing feet. Whipping my head to the side, I saw a blur heading straight for me. Not needing to think, I brought one of my legs up and onto the saddle, using it to push myself into the air, as the figure slammed into my startled horse. Flipping midair to get a look at my vampiric attacker before I landed, I was startled to see him crouched over my now dead horse drinking from its neck. Landing 10 feet from them, on the dirt path on one of my knees, I stayed still, watching what was happening right before my eyes. What I could see of the figure, was a head of long dirty white hair, and pale white skin as they drank my horse dry. "Adam! Is that you?" I asked urgently, as I stood to my feet. But I didn't get a response. Taking a step forward, I tried to get a better look at them, but the side of my horse was covering most of their face. "Adam!" I again asked urgently. This time when I spoke, the figure's head shot up and looked in my direction. The first thing to catch my attention was the blood-red eyes that were partially covered by the person's long locks. The second thing was that this person wasn't Adam, but was instead someone else. He looked to be in his early to mid-20s, and scared as hell. Chronicling back down slowly, I raised a hand. "Hello," I said, simply. The young man pushed himself off my dead horse's body, giving me a better look at him. His fine clothes were torn and covered in a brown substance that smelled too bad to just be dirt. My thoughts were cut off by a well-spoken soft voice. How did you do that?" the young man asked, never looking away from me. "A newborn," I thought, as I looked at him with a raised brow. "It's because I'm like you," I said, looking into his eyes for a reaction. "You're a monster like me?" the young man asked in a panic as he stood to his feet, in a blur of motion. "We are not monsters," I said, raising a finger at him. "We are no different than regular humans," I continued. "You lie!" he shouted. "I have become the spawn of Satan," the distressed young man yelled as he pointed at the horse. "I crave the blood of the living, I crave human blood," he continued, in a whisper. Was I once like this as well? I couldn't help but think, as the memories of my first night as a vampire flooded my mind. "What is your name?" I asked, in an attempt to redirect his thoughts. The young man stood there for a moment, as he looked at me. "My name is Carlile. Carlile Cullen," he said, in a strong voice. "Nice to meet you, Carlile, I'm Julius," I said, with a wide smile, making sure my slightly elongated canines. Chapter 72, Carlile. POV Carlile ///1640. I managed to escape, but the others were not so lucky. I ran lost in the deep underground sewers that were littered under the streets of London. But the fire that radiated through my body from the bite had become too much for my body to handle and I passed out. I don't know how long I had slept for, but when I woke, I felt completely different. I was able to lift myself from the ground, as if I weighed as much as a feather. The once pitch blackness of the sewers was now like a shadowed room. Not bright, but nor was it dark. Instead it was a light grey color that allowed me to see farther than I believed I ever could have before. But overshadowing all of that was the smell. The putrid smells that bombarded me, made me want to heave, and want out of this place as soon as possible. It didn't take me long to find an exit. Coming out, I was greeted by the large half-moon that shone its light down upon me. I took in a large lungful of air, then released it. That's when the memories of why I had found myself in such a perilous situation hit me. Scrabbling for my collar, I felt for where I had been bitten. But there was nothing but dried scum from my venture of the sewers. A weight was dropped from my shoulders as I guessed I had only been nicked, or it had been my imagination. Closing my eyes, I dropped a hand to my chest, and thought of a prayer to the Lord for my protection. But as I placed my hand over my heart, I felt nothing. Slowly opening my eyes, I checked again by shoving a hand up my tunic to feel again. But like before there was nothing. Also, there was something wrong with my skin. Instead of the warm soft flesh I once had, I now felt a cold rough texture, that felt like slightly hardened skin. But unbeknownst to myself, as I was lost in my panicked thoughts, a drunk man carrying a bottle in hand, had started to stumble down the alley where I had found my exit. The drunkard stumbled to the side, hitting the wall. But as he tried to stop himself, he used the hand with the bottle. The man cut his hand as the bottle burst under his exorbitant weight, sending my brain into a frenzy, as the soft wind blew the scent of his blood in my direction. I could barely hold myself together, and keep myself back from what my body instinctively wanted me to do. Using one of my hands, I covered my nose and mouth, as a liquid that tasted different than my saliva filled my mouth, making the thought of blood filling my mouth a better idea than the bitter saliva. Taking a step away, I watched as streams of blood flowed freely down the man's hand and forearm, as he cursed a storm my father would have disapproved of greatly. My eyes seemed to be stuck on the crimson droplets as they fell to the ground in slow motion. I must leave, I mustn't become one of those demons, I thought, before I used all of my force to turn away from the hurt drunk man. As I turned, I started to run, to get away from the smell and sight of blood, as I felt my self-control slipping away from me. But as I ran, everything around me blurred, as I found myself at the other end of the long alley, before I even knew what had happened. But again, as I came to the end of the alley, I was met with more night-goers, who were out and about to enjoy the late-night drinking at the many pubs that scattered London. Their smell, it's so. I cut myself off as I felt myself think of the smells I was finding so delicious. Biting down on my lip, I forced myself to put my head down, as I tried to get away without running and drawing more attention from those who passed me as I was already getting from them. It was like agony, as thoughts filled my head of murdering everyone I passed, to quench the thirst that was becoming worse by every second. But I would rather die, than kill an innocent person for my own needs. It seemed an eternity before I finally managed to leave the city itself, and be gone from that hell that wanted me to sin, the most terrible of sins, murder. Now gone from the city, I started to run again, without a destination or plan in mind, other than to save those who were in danger of myself. For an untold distance I ran, until I finally came to a halt. What have I become? I thought as I fell to my knees. A well of fear and anger filled my heart as I thought of the demon I had become. Something my father had committed his life to eradicating. Streams of a light white liquid fell down my cheeks as I looked up at the moon that seemed to hang right above my head. Why have I been so forsaken, to become such as I have? I whispered to the moon, hoping God could give me an answer for this. But there was nothing. Closing my eyes, I dug my hands into the soft earth, as I grieved. But as I wallowed in my self-pity, my ears picked up the sound of horse hooves in the distance. My eyes snapped open, as the sound came to me. And finally filled with grief and anger. I let myself be overtaken, and let my instincts take over. In a blur of motion, I shot away and headed towards the sound of a horse, which always meant person. I sat in the back of my mind as I watched my body run towards the sound. Dodging trees and brush, I was like a wolf on the hunt for its prey. But as I came out of the tree, I managed to get a look at the young man who was seated atop the horse. He looked no older than a boy of 16 years. With fine black hair in a ponytail, and fine clothes. And a sickness clutched at my soul as I thought of cutting this young man's life so short. In an instant, I regained control of myself for only a moment, as I changed my direction from the boy to the dark brown horse he rode. Chapter 73, The Americas. Sorry everyone, my and my brother's truck got totaled the other day while it was parked, so I have been dealing with all that for the past few days and haven't really been in the writing mood. I felt sick, and I mean holy fuck, why am I so stupid sick? I wasn't actually sick or anything, it just felt like the ship was being steered by a 5-year-old with ADHD that thinks hitting every wave is fun. Causing me to be nauseous. Adding to that and the waves, was the smell of the inside of the ship. The pungent smell of unwashed men nearly brought tears to my eyes, as if I was pepper sprayed. Thankfully our voyage was coming to an end, as it had nearly been 3 months of this torture. I managed to bribe one of the master mates of the ship enough to get a meeting with the man himself, Christopher Columbus. And let me tell you, the man was a dick. I don't know if he had always been like that, or if it was a rather new development, that caused him to become quite the arrogant prick or not, but the man was just a straight-up asshole. But I, the ever-professional, managed not to tear his head off and shove it where the sun doesn't shine, leaving later generations to wonder where his head went, when it was right in front of them the whole time. Instead, I managed to bribe him to take me with him, and to drop me off in the new world. Surprisingly, at first he was a little hesitant, or at least he was until I gave him a bag of gold the size of his head. I didn't end up on the same ship as him, but on one of the other 17 ships that left to the new world, that would drop me off along the coast of what will become Mexico, while Columbus and the other 16 ships would be looking for somewhere to build an outpost for future colonization. We separated from the other ships about 3 days ago, and land had finally come into sight. Standing on the deck, all I had with me was a broadsword strapped to my waist and some heavy-duty clothes that would last longer than regular fabrics. Other than that, I had nothing else to bring with me. Everyone on the ship thought I was insane, but I didn't care. I was finally coming back to the Americas. By this time, my hair had also reverted back to its usual white color, from the 3 months I didn't re-dye it. Thankfully, none of the men on board were particularly religious men, and left me alone. The ship stopped a good distance from the shore, so I was brought to it by a small rowboat. The water was crystal clear and the golden sand under it gleamed in the sun. As the small boat hit the sand, I leaped from it, hit the sand with my boot-covered feet. Some 20 yards from the shore was a long line of dark jungle. Giving the rowboat a hand to get them off the sand and back in the water, I watched as the rowboat made its way back to the ship, giving them a wave as they left. After a few moments, I turned to look at the jungle behind me. Looking at my system's map, I found I was dropped off towards the middle of Mexico. Tecolootla. Scattered in all directions were different blue dots resembling places of population. But there was one not too far from myself that seemed to be the biggest one. So now with a destination in mind, I headed in that direction. The tropical landscape reminded me of India, with its thick green tundles. Slowly making my way into the jungles, I listened to the buzz of the wildlife all around me, from the bugs, to the chirping of birds that flew from tree to tree. It didn't take long for me to traverse the jungle, and come into contact with the inhabitants of this land. It seemed I had been found by a hunting party of young men, all of whom had spears, and small bows. To say they were startled would be an understatement. Most of them were smaller in stature, around 5'4", with wide facial structures and black hair with brown eyes. All of them only wore a fiber cloth around their waists, and had weird headbands with feathers around their heads. I had heard them long before I had even seen them. With the thick tropical brush in their way, it was like a small stampede was heading straight towards me. I stood still and waited for them to see me, which wouldn't have been hard. I stood well over 6 feet tall and had white hair. I couldn't have stuck out more than a kangaroo in a dinner jacket at a fancy dinner party. When the man leading the group first caught sight of me, his first instinct was to react, which was to bring a tube-looking thing to his lips and blow a dart right for my chest. Likewise, I acted on instinct. Catching the fast projectile with my hand, I brought the dart up and looked at it, while the group of hunters looked at me in astonishment. The dart looked to be a thin piece of wood shaped like a nail with a dark blue feather on the back of it. Looking up at the group of younger-looking me, they seemed to freeze when they saw me. Dropping the dart to the ground, I lifted a hand to wave at them. "Hello," I said, trying not to seem threatening to them in any way. They all looked at each other when I spoke, all in clear confusion at my words. Tapping my chest, I spoke again. "Adam, friend," I said slowly, knowing they didn't understand my words. The first to respond was the one who had shot the dart at my chest, who I guessed was the leader of the group. He only took one step forward, making sure to keep his spear at the ready, just in case I decided to do anything funny, even though if I wanted to kill him, his spear wouldn't slow me down in the slightest. The man seemed to be in his mid to early 30s, with a few scars running along his arms and on the side of his face. He spoke to me in a language I had never heard before, and resembled no language I knew. But he did hit his chest a few times, so I guessed at what he was saying. "Oh Kotlin," he said again, tapping his chest. "Oh Kotlin," I said, pointing at him. He nodded his head and a smile grew on his face. Surprising me, Oh Kotlin took a few more steps forward until he was only standing a few feet in front of me, looking me up and down. He nodded his head a few times, seeming mystified at the clothes I wore, as well as the strange color of my hair. Him stepping forward was like a break in the dam, and before I knew what was happening, I was surrounded by the entire group of hunters, who were poking at me and feeling the rough cloths I was currently wearing. And a few times one of them would pull at my hair, and rub the strands through their fingers, looking to see if the color was real or some kind of trick. But once one of them went to pull my sword from my side, that's when I decided to put an end to whatever was happening. Grabbing the handle of the sword, I pushed it back down into the scabbard as I took a step back, and away from the group. They seemed confused at what had just happened and why I had stepped away from them. That's when Kotlin started speaking to the group again, and from the sound of it, he didn't sound happy about something, and was chiding the group. The verbal beating only lasted a few moments, before he turned to me and spoke again, more than likely an apology. I just nodded my head, and smiled. From there he started to wave at me to follow the group. Which I did. For close to an hour I followed them through the hot jungle, until we got to the top of a rather large hill, and I got my first sight of their home. What I saw truly baffled me. Sitting in the middle of a lake was an island with a massive city on it, with 3 bridges connecting it to land. The island had thousands of houses on it, and from where I stood, I could see a total of 6 large pyramids on it, with one truly massive one in the middle. They weren't as large as the ones in Egypt, but the biggest one got pretty close to the smaller ones that had been built over there. Making our way to one of the bridges, we started to pass others who were going about their days. All of them stopped to stare at me as we passed. Most of them, man or woman, wore tunic-looking shirts that went to their knees with belts to keep them on, with sandals on their feet. And it also surprised me to see not one of them was over 5'5", making me feel like a true giant among normal people. The farther into the large city, the more impressed I was. Because unlike what I had experienced in Europe and other places, this city seemed to actually be planned and well laid out, with dirt streets and one-level homes in perfect placements. But when we passed a massive market that had thousands of people walking about, was when I truly had to take a moment to soak everything in. But I couldn't think for long, because people were starting to notice me, and they wanted a closer look at me. Swarms of people started to appear all around me in a mob, all wanting to look at me. Thankfully Ocotlin and his other hunters used their spears to keep them at bay. Pushing me along, Ocotlin pointed towards the pyramids as a destination for us to go. So with a large mob of people following we continued, until we were standing in front of the largest pyramid. Standing in front of it, was a group of older men, who seemed to have been warned of my arrival. They all wore more beads and other knickknacks than anyone else I had seen so far. They also had large head dresses on them that had large feathers of different colors with gold inlays on the metallic headbands. But standing in the middle of them, was a man that had the same kind of head dress, but all it had was green feathers, and a pure gold band on it, with a jewel right in the middle. He seems important. I couldn't help but think, as he looked me dead in the eyes for a few moments. But wanting things to get too awkward, I lifted my hand, and spoke. Hello. As soon as I spoke, it was like my interactions with the hunters. Whispered conversations spread over the crowd, while the man in the green headdress turned to the other men by him, while they whispered in his ear. After a few minutes of this, the man in the green headdress raised his hands into the air and spoke. To me it seemed he was quieting the crowd of people. And within seconds it was quiet again. Allowing the man to speak again. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but it was like he was giving a speech, before he pointed at the clear blue sky, then yelled a few more words. His words seemed to send the crowd into an excited frenzy, before they all started to chant. And to be honest it sounded kinda eerie, and haunting. Then a middle-aged man eagerly stepped from the crowd and approached the group of men in headdresses. As soon as everyone saw this, they let out a loud cheer that made me go deaf for a moment. I was confused as all of this happened, until Ocotlin stepped up beside me, and smiled up at me, and spoke in his language. But I still couldn't understand. But he tugged my arm, and led me to the man in the green headdress, and before I knew what was happening, I was led to a large stone building, that I guessed was a small palace, and was taking a bath, in heated water. By the time I was out, the sun was starting to lower, and I was led back to the pyramids, which by this time, was lit with many torches, and was nearly completely surrounded by people. I was led to a shaded area that had nice wooden chairs with the man in the green headdress seated. When he saw me, he gave me a wide smile, and pointed to another chair next to his, which I gladly expected. By this point, I figured he was the ruler of these people, and I should just do as he says. As I sat, a pretty woman came by with clay mugs of an aromatic-smelling drink, which I soon found out, tasted like mangoes, and had an alcoholic aftertaste. I couldn't help but down the drink in one large gulp, as a flavor I hadn't had tasted in thousands of years touched my tongue. When the leader of these people saw this, he pointed at the woman again, and told her something. But shortly after she came back with a jug of this stuff, I couldn't stop myself from grabbing the entire thing from her, and downing even more of it. Which made the man in the green headdress laugh loudly. Holding my second jug in my lap I now sipped it instead of chugging it, when another lady came by, holding bowls of fruit, which she handed to her leader with a bow, then myself, also giving me a bow. What I saw in the bowl was an assortment of different fruits like banana, mango, papaya, and guava. I couldn't help but let out a smile as saliva filled my mouth at the sight. Because for so long I had only eaten bland foods that never really had a sweetness to it, but now I was practically in heaven, as I started to eat with my hands. 9 whole bowls later, something started to happen at the top of the largest pyramid, as a large flame was lit at the very top. Setting my bowl down, I took another long sip of my fruity mango beverage, as I watched what was happening. With my perfect eyesight, I was able to see perfectly what was happening. Standing all the way at the top of the pyramid, was the middle-aged man from earlier today, as well as the other men with head dresses. They seemed to be talking, when he was led to a pedestal by the stairs. Then to my bewilderment, they started tying him down, so his head was right over the stairs. That's strange. I thought. That was before one of the head-dressed men pulled out something that looked like a long paddle with sharp ends and started chopping the man's head off. Choking on my fruity drink, I couldn't help but be startled at the sight of butchery that was taking place so suddenly. In 2 solid swings, the man's head was cut clean off, and started bouncing down the many steps, while blood spurted from his headless neck. "Oh fuck!" I said, as I watched the head bouncing. Oh fuck!" the leader of these people said next to me as he gestured to the skeptical. In the days after that, I managed to put the pieces together of who these people were. It took me so long, because being someone from the far northeast of America, Aztec cultures wasn't exactly a common top. At first I couldn't tell if this was an Aztec city or a Maya. But I heard they called themselves the Mexica, which sparked a cloudy almost forgotten memory in my head, about a Joe Rogan podcast I hadn't listened to in a while, about ancient civilizations in Mexico, and the man who was explaining a Aztec city deep in the forest that had been covered completely by the forest. He refused to them as the Mexica people. I know Joe Rogan did have a podcast about this topic, but I don't think that was ever brought up. Thankfully, they didn't have any more sacrifices while I stayed there, but even if they did, I wouldn't do anything about it. This was their way of life, and I had no right to stop them from doing something that was part of their culture. I ended up staying for roughly a month, before I decided it was time to continue my journey. So late at night, I gathered all I had gotten while here, and left, not leaving a trace to be tracked. I ended up continuing south, where I ended up running into the Maya people, where something like what happened with the Aztec people happened. I was led to a large city, where a sacrifice was done on a large pyramid, and a celebration ensued. Again I didn't stay too long, and continued south, running into other much smaller groups of people, and tribes. I lost track of time as I finally made it to the bottom of the South American continent, and got a look at the gleaming blue sea. To get here I had to travel through some of the harshest terrain I had ever experienced before, and I couldn't have been happier. I managed to see some crazy wildlife up close, and be the first person from the outside world to come into contact with certain tribes. It took another year for me to make my way back up to Mexico, where I made stops at some of the Maya and Aztec cities, before I continued north after passing the Rio Grande River. As soon as I was on the other side, I could help but fall to my knees and give the dirt a kiss, out of pure excitement. I started my journey, by going through Texas, at a westward angle, hoping to make it to the Grand Canyon. At the moment, I was walking next to Tony, my alpaca who was carrying the cool knickknacks I had collected over my journey, as well as my food and water skins. The reason I was using an alpaca to carry everything instead of a horse was because, to my surprise, there are no horses in the Americas yet, or at least there might be and I just haven't found any. And due to the fact that most of Mexico is intense jungle terrain at the moment, anything bigger than the 100-pound Tony wouldn't be able to move through it. I got Tony as a gift from a town leader, when he was still young. And over my travels, I taught him to stay with me and to not wander off, or particularly not to spit at me. Tony had white poofy hair that I had to cut every now and again, but other than that he was great. Surprisingly, I didn't run into a single person during my entire trip, and after 4 months of continuous walking, I finally got my first glimpse of something I never saw in person in my last life, the Grand Canyon. It was stunning to see, and truly breathtaking. With its red rocks that can be seen for miles, and its large peaks, I couldn't help but find it all relaxing. But after a few days of camping out there, I decided to head west again, in search of some shape-shifting humans. Using my system's map, I headed towards Washington State, where I saw a few small blue dots. Along the way I came in contact with my first Native American tribe, but unfortunately they were on the move, and wanted nothing to do with me, so stayed at a distance and only watched me. That was fine by me though, because I had a few hundred years to get to know them. Continuing on, I managed to meet a few more tribes who actually seemed interested in me. Though at first they were hesitant, they eventually came around. Something I learned as I met other tribes was that their languages were all different. Sure, some had similarities, but at the same time, they were completely different. Also, their traditions as well as their styles differed greatly from tribe to tribe. Some tribes liked to cover themselves in paints, while some preferred to create bands out of animal hides. It varied greatly among each. But as I slowly made my way northwest, I managed to learn enough of their languages that I became a sort of traveling storyteller, where I would tell the stories of Europe to them. Like Homer's Odyssey, The Boy Who Called Wolf by Aesop, or Mahabharata by Vyasa. Using Tony as my sidekick in all of the stores. But eventually, I made it to Washington state. By this point, I had taken on some of the dresswear of the people of this land. I no longer wore a shirt, and decided to let my hair grow extra long again. My pants were warm animal hide, as well as my makeshift shoes. Tony looked mostly the same, but had different colored beads in his locks that hung past his head. Making it to the state of Washington, I really got to see why the Cullen clan liked it here so much. It was beautiful, and as I made it to the Olympic region of the state, I found a place perfect for vampire inhabitants who would want to live among humans. It was always cloudy and raining here. Following my map, I found the Quileutes easily. Among the tall trees and by a rocky river, the tribe thrived. Chapter 74, Onwards. The Quileutes were like many of the other native tribes I had met before. At first, the Quileutes were a bit standoffish, which I can't blame. How many people have they ever seen that look like I do? So quickly, they sent a small war band of their warriors to come and meet me. As I explained that I was a traveler who only seek to tell tales, for some food and shelter, they seemed a bit more receptive to my presence. As it turned out, they had recently had a large number of accidents and sickness in the tribe. So as a show of friendship, I asked to be taken to any of their wounded or sick. Again they seemed a bit hesitant, but a young-looking warrior who for some reason seemed to be in charge, nodded his head a few times before telling me to follow him. As we walked, I was able to see deeper into the trees, where two long huts that looked like long houses stood. They were made out of woven tree limbs and had a thatched roof of dry reeds. In front of both were a small collection of fires where a group of elderly sat, bundled in animal furs. As they caught sight of me, a few of the elders started to talk to one another. But I didn't have a chance to listen in, because I was led into a large open area of one of the longhouses. Stepping into the dim area that was only lit by a smoldering fire in the middle, I was able to see people laying on mats on the ground. As I looked at them, I was able to see that some of them had wounds with makeshift herbal bandages, while some looked very sick. Nodding my head, I turned to the young warrior. On my alpaca, or animal friend, there is a large black fur bag, grab it and bring it to me. I said, as I kneeled down next to the person in front of me, to look at their symptoms. The middle-aged man had a high fever and was sweating like crazy. Looking him over, I didn't see a rash or cuts that might show that it was an infection. Probably a cold or the flu. I said as I felt the man's burning head. Just then the young warrior came back with the bag. That animal of yours is quite strange, he spit at me. He said, as he set the bag next to me. Yeah, Tony tends to do that to strangers he doesn't know while I'm not around. I said, mindlessly, and with a chuckle, as I opened my herbal bag. Opening the bag, I grabbed a plant I had gotten in South America. Its name was echinacea, and was a miracle plant when it came to the cold or flu. Grabbing the plant, I turned to the warrior again. Please get me some water. Turning, he left at a run. Leaving the other warriors to stand around and watch me. Looking around, I saw that a steady wind was coming through the open ending of the longhouse. Turning to the warriors who were standing there watching me, I asked. Is there any way we can close the end off, so it will warm up in here? They looked at each other for a moment, when one of them separated and pulled a shutter-style door across. It was like the rest of the hut, made of thin woven tree branches and stems, with moss pressed between the cracks. Now with that done, I turned to the smoldering fire, and threw a few of the branches that lay not far away onto the fire, then pulled the man's mat closer to the fire. Not too close where he would be burning up, but where he would be warm. Coming back with a large wooden bowl of water, the young warrior set the bowl by my side. Nodding my head, I pulled a bundle of fabric I had saved from the old clothes I had come to the Americas with. Dunking a line of the fabric in the water, I started to cool the man off. Someone will need to do this repeatedly, until the fever breaks. I told the young warrior, who seemed very interested in what I had been doing. Delving back into my large bag of goodies, I pulled out a clay cup that had a small circular lid. Dumping the clay cup in the water, I added the echinacea, which I had crushed in my hands, then rubbed together to get all the inside properties to activate. Once that was done, I added it to the clay cup. Putting the lid on, I set the clay cup in the outside embers of the fire. Turning to the warrior by my side, I had him continue cooling off the man while I went and started to check the others in the longhouse. Most of the people in the longhouse were suffering an assortment of different injuries and illnesses. Most illnesses were a mix of the flu or cold, with your everyday ate-something bad issues tossed in. But those with injuries were the real issues. Cuts and the occasional twisted ankle were sprinkled in with those who had severe injuries. One man had fallen off a tree and had a broken arm I would need to reset, while another had a run-in with a bear, and ended up with a couple of deep claw marks before the rest of the hunting party he had been a part of could reach him, and ward it off. For the rest of the day and half the night, I and the young warrior worked to bring these people back to wellness. At one point, the young man, who seemed to be in charge, ordered the others who had been watching us to help. And even a few of the women and girls of the tribe contributed, by bringing fresh water, as well as anything else we would need. With my bag of herbs and my knowledge, we broke the fevers of many of those in the longhouse by giving them herbal teas to fight any infections or illnesses they had. While those with injuries I helped the best I could. It truly amazed me to see the unwavering dedication the young warrior put in during the whole process. Not once did he take a break or stop, even though a few of the others who had started after us had long ago flagged. Once during the night, when we were finally able to take our first break, I got to ask the young man his name. Clay Black was the translated name I got. And as it turned out, he was the current chief of the Quileutes. Although young, he was a nice enough kid with a good heart for his people. I ended up staying with the Quileutes for a solid 4 months, where I told my stories, and helped around the village as best I could. I also showed them how to make herbal remedies that could help avoid the illnesses they had been suffering, with the local plant life. And to my amazement, not once did I see or hear of any of them shifting into wolves, the whole time I was there. But one night before I was to leave, the elders who loved my own stories, decided to tell me the tale of the Quileute tribe. They talked of a deity who came to the clan, and showed them how to spirit walk. Then of a great betrayal to a chief of the clan, by another member of the tribe, who could also spirit walk. The member cut off the strand, holding the chief's spirit to his body, making it impossible for the chief to return to his body and to wander the land as nothing more than a spirit. Filled with rage, the chief wanted nothing more than to return to his tribe and get vengeance on the wrongdoer, who had taken over as chief. While wandering the surrounding forest, thinking of a way to get back to his tribe, he stumbled upon a completely white wolf. The wolf seemed so majestic to him, he couldn't stop himself from getting close to the wolf. As he got closer, he felt a pulling sensation. And before he could do anything about it, he was pulled into the wolf itself, where he and the wolf merged together as one. Then as the wolf, the chief returned to the tribe, and killed the traitorous chief. But not long after killing the traitorous chief, the chief, as a wolf, was attacked by his own clan members, where he was wounded. Running away, the chief in his wolf form, hid in the forest. But waking the next day, he realized he was human again, and not a wolf or a spirit. Returning to the village, the chief told his story to his people, of the usurper, and of his new abilities. And from that day, the descendants of his gained the ability to change to that of a great wolf to protect the tribe. It was a very interesting story that shone light on some of the things I had always wondered about. And it made me wonder. Who was this deity that showed them to spirit walk? It is possible that there was no deity, and it could just be a whole mix-up of the original story, like how I became the first human. But who knows? Early the next day, I set out again, and started making my way east. Not long after leaving, I saw from a distance atop a large wooded hill, Mount St. Helens, and damn, was it majestic. Continuing east, I made a sort of zigzag, going to anything interesting that I saw and could remember. Like Yellowstone, with its hot springs, and the numerous other incredible places across America that I never experienced before. One of my favorites was the Great Plains, and the massive herds of buffalo, that could be in the hundreds of thousands. Or when I got to Niagara Falls, which was way bigger than I imagined. But unfortunately, Tony got sick around that time, and passed away. I was sad, but how many alpacas have traveled as much as he ever did, and lived such a good life? I kept the beads of his, and made a bracelet from them. I wasn't sure why his death affected me so much compared to the other numerous animals I have had and have passed away before. Maybe it was because he was the only constant that has been with me throughout most of my travels through the Americas, or maybe it was because I was tired of being lonely. Chapter 75, Update. Hey everyone! I just wanted to get this out there. I have finally started a Patreon. At the moment there is only one chapter in advance posted. But I plan on doing 4 extra chapters in advance. https://www.patreon.com/bean_on_tree. Thank you all. Bean. Chapter 76, Back Home. April 5, 1641. 5641 years in world. Thank you truly, Mr. Gotts. I don't believe we would have made it through this voyage whole without your help. David Jones, the captain of the ship I had just departed from, said, as we shook forearms. Of course, Captain. I couldn't let my chance of finally getting home turn back. I said, with a laugh. When the Pilgrims first arrived in Massachusetts, I had been waiting for them. Talk about a bunch of bewildered people. But with a very well-rehearsed backstory, I managed to gain their trust. My story was that I was shipwrecked and that I was the only survivor of the ship. The fact I looked mostly like them and could speak perfect English persuaded them enough to trust me. I decided to help them come in contact with the Wampanoag tribe. Otherwise known as the tribe that helped the Pilgrims through their first winter here. I had long since come to terms with the bad side of what will happen when more European settlers come to the Americas. It's inevitable that more will come, and no matter what I do, more and more people will still come. My hope of introducing the Pilgrims to the natives and telling the Pilgrims of the natives' culture, was to curb some of the fighting that might arise from misunderstandings. But truthfully, I didn't have high hopes that it would really change anything. The diseases that will wipe out an untold number of native tribes were impossible to stop. Just like the fighting. But that didn't mean I would let the natives be wronged like they originally were in my old world. So, I ended up staying longer than I had originally intended. Being the peacekeeper between the two groups. But after I managed to teach a few of the Europeans the native language, as well as English for some of the natives, I decided to let things play out. I won't always be around to hold their hands. On the return voyage to England, we had been forced through 2 massive storms that would have done extreme damage to the ship if it wasn't for me. Thankfully, the mainmast didn't break, but a few of the boards below did, sending geysers of water into the belly of the ship. But with my strength, I was able to plug the leaks in minutes while it would have taken the other crew members much longer, allowing us to keep going, instead of turning back. Are you sure you don't want the pay for your work? Captain Jones asked as we released our grips. I'm sure. I said, picking up my 2 large bags from beside me. I should get going, though. Let the family know I'm still kicking. I said, with another laugh and a wave, as I turned and started walking. As I traversed the bustling streets of London, I couldn't help but be amazed at all the new structures that filled the now massive city, as well as the numerous shops that filled the narrow streets. It was clear that there was no rhyme or reason for any of the streets, making it clear that there was no planning involved with the mishmash and confusing street layout. I had been forced to turn around a few times when I took the wrong street by mistake. After the second time, I resorted to using my system map to help me out before I decided to just use the rooftops to make it out. Eventually, I managed to find my way out of the city. And from there, it took me only an hour to finally see the castle, which now had a large stone wall with a gatehouse around it. Also, with a rather large-sized town surrounding it. Walking towards the large drawbridge gate that was currently open, I looked around the town. Compared to London, the town was perfect. Clean cobbled road going straight down the center of town, and well-kept houses and shops lining it. The people themselves were in better shape than most Londoners, with clean clothes and full unemaciated figures. It was clear to see these people weren't struggling as badly as some others. Finally reaching the drawbridge, I walked past a pair of guards in fine clothes and shining chest plates with helmets. Both men had stoic expressions on their faces and looked like they knew how to hold themselves. At their waists was a short sword in perfectly maintained scabbard. But propped on the ground between their legs, was a musket. With the butt on the ground, they held the barrel with both hands while staring forward. As I passed through the gatehouse, I was stopped by 3 other guards in the same attire as the ones standing by the drawbridge entrance. 2 of them carried their muskets on their shoulders, while the leading man only had his short sword. It was clear he was the leader. as his armor had fine work added to his, and a plume of white feathers seemingly sprouting from his helmet. The whole ensemble was finished off with a large mustache that was curled at the ends. "Good evening, sir," the lead guard said as he stepped in front of me to stop me from entering. "Here we go again," I thought, with a small eye roll, as memories of the last time I was stopped entered my head. "Are you here to see Lord Julius?" the guard asked as he unfurled a rolled scroll. "That I am," I said, giving him my best smile. He nodded his head, then asked, "And your name, sir?" At least this time, they are being polite, I thought with a chuckle, as I answered. "Adam Gotts," I said, using my alias. All three of them seemed to freeze at my words. Adam?" the guard asked as he looked up from his scroll, then at me. I nodded my head. "That's me," I said, with a raised eyebrow. The guard's eyes flicked up to my hair and seemed to widen even more. Then, in a clearly well-rehearsed movement, all three of them dropped to their knees and bowed their heads. "We have been expecting you, Lord," the lead guard said as he bowed his head even deeper. For a moment, I was taken aback. Normally, I have to knock some sense into people before they believe me. But this guy clearly knows who I am. You can stand now," I said. Thankfully, not needing to be asked twice, they stood again, with backs straight and their chests out. "Lord Julius will wish to see you at once, Lord. Please follow us," the lead guard said in an almost reverent tone. Doing as he said, I followed closely behind the group as they marched towards the entrance of the castle. Reaching the large wooden doors, we had shipped from Germany, I watched as they pushed them open, entering the large entry hall, otherwise known as the kill box. Looking up, I saw two guards standing, ready for intruders. From there, we passed two more large doors, where we finally entered the great hall, which hadn't changed since the last time I was here, with arching ceilings, marble pillars, and floor. The entrance was created to make a statement to any visitors, and that was of wealth. It might not be the biggest one, but this castle was hands down the finest of them all. And if Julius hadn't paid an exorbitant amount of gold to be allowed to build it, and keep it, it would have long ago been taken by a king or queen as their own, since it even put the kings to shame. "Right this way, Lord," the lead guard said, as he gestured with his arm, toward a medium-sized door, which I remembered to be the large business room, where any visitors with business were greeted. Stopping the two other guards outside the room, the lead guard pushed the doors open and gestured me in. Nodding my head, I thanked him before he closed the door behind me. Stepping into the large opulent room, I looked around. The room was large, with a red rug taking up much of the ground, covering the stone, while the walls were covered in some of my paintings and a few tapestries, which depicted battles or stories. But smack dab in the middle was a large oak desk that had a high-backed chair behind it, with stacks of paper cluttering the desk. But what caught my eyes was the figure sitting behind that desk and in that chair. "Just one moment, sir," Julius said as he scribbled away at some parchment with a quill. "Sure, take your time. It's only been a few hundred years after all," I said, with a smile, as I tried to keep the mirth from my voice. The quill made a loud scratch as it came to an abrupt halt. And like a bullet shot from a gun, Julius's head shot up, a split second before he rocketed from his seat, right for me. I only had time to toss my bags to the side before he slammed into me in a rib-cracking bear hug. "Adam," Julius said excitedly. "It's good to see you, kid," I said, with a loud laugh, as I patted his back. Separating from me, Julius looked me up and down. "Where on earth have you been?" he asked sternly. "Oh, you know me. I was just on a little exploration trip, that's all." "A little exploration trip? Adam, we have been looking for you for decades," Julius said, now sounding truly angered. "Normally, we can tell your general location anytime you stop at one of the banks. But for nearly the past 200 years, nothing. It was as if you fell off the side of the earth," Julius said as he looked at my two large bags. "Well, to be honest, I kind of did," I said, with a cheeky smile. Julius raised one of his eyebrows. "What?" he asked. "I may or may not have taken a trip with Columbus to the New World on his second voyage," I said, as I watched Julius's facial expression morph, as he went through a myriad of emotions. From anger to confusion. Before settling on amusement. Jane won the bet. Julius said with a chuckle. Now, it was my turn to be confused. Bet? I asked. Yes. We had a small bet going on where you might have gone. Julius said with another chuckle. I thought you might have gone east to Asia, to live like some hermit on a mountain. While Jane had gold on you being somewhere none of us had ever been before. Julius said as he shook his head. My, what great friends the two of you are. I said, bemused. Well, come now, tell me about your journey. Julius said as he gestured to the two chairs in front of his desk. And so, I did. I told him of my trip there and of the natives of the land. I told him of the incredible places, like the Grand Canyon, or Niagara Falls, Yellowstone, and the many other places. I told him of the nomadic tribes that lived on the land and their culture. I didn't tell him of the Quileute tribe just yet and preferred to keep that to myself at the moment. As I was telling him of the voyage back to London, the doors to the room were pushed open. Julius. May I have a word? A man said, from behind me. Turning my head, I saw a man of medium height stepping into the room. Ah, Carlile, just the man I was about to send for. Julius said as he stood to his feet. I would like to finally introduce you to the man I have been telling you about. Julius said. Chapter 77, Soul? Julius POV. 1 month after meeting in the forest. Opening the secret entrance to the basement library. I descended the stone staircase that spiraled. The staircase itself was not lit by light. But the large room at the bottom was. This guy really needs to get out more. I thought, as I reached the bottom. The castle's secret library was a few 100 feet long, and a few dozen wide. With large wooden bookshelves stacked full to almost bursting, with the books and scrolls I, Adam, and Jane, had collected over the years. All from our travels across the land. Looking around, I saw the large table that sat in the front of the room, completely covered in books and scrolls. But looking around, I couldn't find Carlile. Who was normally seated at that table, reading one of the books or scrolls. Carlile. Where are you? I softly called out. Back here. Came the muffled voice of Carlile. All the way in the back. I thought, as I started towards him. The familiar smell of the old parchment paper brought back the many memories I myself had down here, or in the last house. Delving into one book or another. Finally making it to the last row of bookshelves. I saw Carlile holding one of the large journals. Ah! I see you have finally found Adam's journals. I said, with a chuckle. This is a journal? Carlile asked. Looking up from the faded pages. It is. I said, leaning on one of the shelves. What language is this? Carlile asked. I have never seen it before. He continued, looking down at the journal again. Well, for starters. You are currently holding the 5th journal. I said, pushing myself off the shelf, and walking past him. Walking to the far end of the last bookshelf, I pulled out a heavily worn book. This is the first one. Inside is a word key for the language. I said, flicking the book open, and pulling the rough sheets out. Altogether, there are over 50 journals. Most of which are written in different languages. Most are dead. I said, handing the 1SR journal, to the confused-looking Carlile. Wait. Carlile said, setting the 5th journal back on the shelf. Who do these journals belong to? He asked. A small smile spread across my face. Read and find out. I said, walking past him. I will be back shortly. Tonight we will be going for a hunt. I said, as I made my way back to the stairs. Reaching the top. I closed the secret door behind me, so none of the servants stumbled upon it. The secret entrance was behind the main fireplace in the great hall. And was truly a marvel of design. Turning a gold lion's head that was set in the fine stonework of the fireplace mantel. Would lower the fire, and replace it with smooth stone. While at the same time lowering the back wall of the fireplace, revealing the stairs. Turning the gold lion's head back, would do the whole process backwards. Until the fire was back in place and the back wall closed up again. With that done, I made my way back to my and Jane's chambers. Opening the door, I stepped into a well-lit room. How was he, love? Jane asked, from her own chair, in front of the crackling fire. He is well. Reading as usual. I said, as I walked up next to her, and leaned down to kiss her. It was your idea to take him down there to keep him away from the servants, Jane said, with a small laugh. True. But I didn't think I would need to drag him out of there every few days so he could feed, I said, plopping down in my recliner. Yes, he seems to enjoy the books, Jane said, while flipping the page of the book she was reading. He just found Adam's journals. So I don't think we will be able to get him away from those for some time, after he learns how to read them, I said, looking into the fire. Just then, the scratchy sensation of thirst started to grow in my throat. I remember the first time I read those. So I must agree with your words, Jane said, with a smile. It is good he found them. We had to tell him eventually, Jane said, closing the book she had just finished. Yes. Knowing Adam, he will just show up out of the blue as if he hasn't been gone for nearly 200 years without a word, I said, shaking my head. Can you blame him, Julius? Both Oliver and Gerard were like his children, and all he could do was slowly watch them perish. Could you imagine the pain that put him through? Jane asked. No, I can't, Julius said, quietly. He is probably just on one of his trips, trying to handle the guilt and sadness he feels about them, Jane said, standing. I still think he's living on some mountain somewhere, I said, with a chuckle. Perhaps. But only time will tell, and we have all the time in the world. He will be back eventually, so stop worrying about him, she said. Now, I don't know about you, but I am feeling a bit peckish, Jane continued, giving me a mischievous smile. For dinner, or dessert? I said, with a coy smile. I've always liked my dessert first, Jane said, turning to the walk towards the bed. In a blur, I was out of my chair and heading for the bed, while tearing my clothes off. A few hours later, the scratchy sensation in my throat was finally becoming an annoyance. As much as I would like to stay here with you, my dear, we need to feed, I said, sitting up in our bed. Me as well, Jane said. Getting dressed was only the work of a few minutes. I will get Carlile, and wait for you in the foyer, I said, as Jane was busy getting dressed. Going back to the fireplace in the main hall of the castle, I repeated my earlier actions. Turning the lion's head, then descending the stairs. Reaching the bottom, I saw what I expected. Seated at the large table was Carlile, nose deep into the journal. Having fun? I asked, as I reached the table. Startled, Carlyle's head shot up. Oh, Julius, back already? He asked. It has been some time. We're almost out of time for a hunt, so we need to get going, I said. Right, yes, Carlile said, as he stood from his chair. Make any progress? I asked him, as we went up the stairs. Yes, the language is quite simple. So it didn't take me long to learn it, Carlile said, from behind me. I let out a laugh. It took me a whole day to learn it. The same goes for Jane. And here you are, learning it in less than a night. Closing the secret entrance. We stood waiting on my beloved. So, who is this Adam? Carlile asked. That's a tricky question, I said, turning to look at him. In what way? Carlile asked. To me, he is my oldest friend and in all reality might as well be my brother, I said, with a smile. But to the rest of the world, he is Adam, the first man. The look of confusion on Carlyle's face was laughable. Wah! Carlile managed to get out, before the voice of Jane interrupted him. He means the Adam, from the Bible, she said, coming to a blurred stop next to me. That's what I said, I shot back, jokingly angered. No, you were being vague, hoping to drag him along, Jane said, stomping down on my hope for a little fun. Wait, Carlile said, now cutting off my and Jane's banter. That can't be possible, Carlile said, now sounding angry. Oh, but it is, Jane said, while grabbing onto my arm. Then that means if I die. What? That you will go to hell, I asked. Carlile slowly nodded his head. And where exactly did you come up with that idea? I asked, preferring to get that idea out of his head now, instead of letting him fight with the idea that his soul was eternally damned for the simple fact that he has become what he has. Where we are the living dead who crave human blood. I interrupted him. You think because we can drink human blood, that we are just soulless beings? I said, with a chuckle. I have a question. I said, taking a step towards him. Do you still have emotions? Do you still feel happy, sad, angry? I asked. Carlile's brow creased. I do, some seem to even be more intense. I snapped my fingers together, and pointed at him. Well, there's your answer. I said, in a happy tone. I don't understand. My hands fell to my side, and I let out a sigh. If you didn't have a soul, Carlile, then you wouldn't feel emotions. You would be an empty husk of nothingness, who is unable to feel. I can't explain it as well as Adam might. But that's the best I have. I said, with a shrug. I grew up believing in a pantheon of gods, so I never had the same moral issue as you, and I don't know what to say that will sway you on this. But the best I can say to you now is to wait for Adam to return. He has been gone for quite some time and will hopefully be back soon, and able to talk with you. I said. But for now, it's time to hunt. I said. Chapter 78, Returned. Carlile POV. April 5, 1641. Years as a Vampire, 1. The scratchy pain in my throat was no longer as bad as it had first been. Especially now that I have had some practice with Julius and Jane. Today was a cloudy day, with a scattering of rain, allowing me to walk the crowded streets of London by myself. I didn't have a destination in mind or a need to buy anything. I just decided to put myself to the test some more around all of these people while I slowly drifted into my thoughts. The conversation between me, Julius, and Jane had re-emerged in my thoughts and replayed themselves. Which still amazed me. Before I had been turned, I was smarter than most. Which, to my folly, is what allowed me to actually track down a real vampire with some others of my deceased father's parish, who convinced me to lead their little group of monster hunters in my father's place. But now, my mind was on a whole new aspect of reality. Any memory I have had after awakening in the sewers is crystal clear in my mind's eye. From the most infinitesimal detail. I seemed to be able to recall it at a simple thought. Breaking from my thoughts, I looked up at the loud bong. That echoed from a church. The church was large and made of large grey stone blocks in a Gothic design. With its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and large stained glass windows. The sight of something that had once given me such comfort now only gave me dread for myself. I forced myself to turn away from it. Even with Julius's words replaying in my head again, I couldn't help but still feel as if I was a damned creature. The stinging pain in my throat that was always there only seemed to drive that thought home in my mind. I need to get back. It's time. I thought, as I waved a rumbling carriage that was passing by to me. The ride back almost seemed an eternity, as I thought of ways to tell Julius and Jane of my decision. Would they be angry? No, they would most likely be disappointed. I thought, as my imagination took hold of my worries and intensified them. The ride was bumpy, and if I wasn't so deep in thought, it would have been miserable, where I would have just decided to walk or run all the way back. Finally, the rocking and shaking of the carriage came to an end as the carriage moved from the uneven and bumpy dirt road to the even cobbled road. Stopping in front of the castle's drawbridge, I got out of the carriage and waved a hand at the driver, who was already pulling away. Walking past the two stationary guards on the entrance, I passed under the gatehouse, where Captain Evergreen and two of his men normally stood. But today, they seemed to be on patrol. Because they were nowhere to be seen. Not spending a second to think about it, I continued into the castle. The inside was mostly quiet. Except for the distant sound of voices and shuffling of the castle servants. But as I headed towards where I knew Julius would be at this time of day, I saw Captain Evergreen and two of his men coming down the hallway. "Good evening, Captain Evergreen," I said as he passed. "Good evening, Lord Cullen," the captain said, with a head bow. His men followed his lead. "On patrol?" I asked, with a small smile. "No, Lord," the captain said with a wide smile. Then, reaching up, the captain touched a necklace he always had around his neck. I had seen it once before, when he and his men were training on the training grounds. It was a simple gold loop with a steel chain. I had seen a few others wearing similar gold ring necklaces as well, but only those in high places that are owned by Julius, or rather Adam. "Ah, well, I should be on my way, Lord," Captain Evergreen said, with a quick salute before he and his men started to walk by. I watched him go, in confusion. Turning back, I continued down the long hall until I reached the large wooden doors of Julius's office. Stopping in front of the large doors for a moment, I readied myself for the conversation I was about to have. Julius and Jane were very nice to me and guided me through this new reality of mine. I felt no pleasure in separating from them. But at the same time, I felt that I needed to leave, to learn more of what I am and who I am now. Taking a step forward, I pushed the doors open. Julius, may I have a word? I asked before the door was fully open. Ah, Carlile, just the man I was about to send for. Julius said, as I finally took a step inside his large office. As I stepped in, I saw that Julius was not alone. A man was seated in one of Julius's chairs, with a relaxed posture. The man was clearly very tall, with slightly pink skin and hair almost as white as snow, that reached down past his shoulders, with a braid on his left temple that went to his chest. In an instant, I realized who this man was. And if I still had a beating heart, it might have stopped. Stepping up beside me, Julius clapped my shoulder. I would like to finally introduce you to the man I have been telling you about. Julius said, in a happy tone. Although I'm sure you have more than likely figured it out by now. I would like to introduce you to Adam. Julius said while gesturing to him. The man, or Adam, stood to his feet, towering nearly a head taller than me. Taking a step forward, Adam put his hand out to shake. It is good to meet you, Carlile. Adam said, in a smooth voice, which was neither too deep nor soft. Mindlessly, I raised my own hand for a shake. His solid grip squeezed my own hand as we shook. Showcasing Adam's strength, as his hands felt like pure steel. My mind was atwirl with turmoil. Do I bow or go to my knees? I thought, as our handshake broke. Through the journals of this man, I had lived for thousands of years. Which was the main reason I wanted to travel. The places he wrote of seemed so magical and wondrous. Adam stepped back as Julius spoke again. Carlile is barely a year old and has already built up enough endurance that he can merge perfectly with society. Julius said as he walked to his desk and leaned on it. Oh really? Adam said as he turned to look at me. Indeed. We believe it has something to do with his power. Julius said. In what way? Adam asked, making his way back to his own chair. When Carlile first came to the surface from the sewers where he was changed, he ran into a drunk, who cut his hand, drawing blood in front of a newborn. Julius said with a smile. He managed to run away before losing control to the thirst. Julius finished. Adam turned to look at me, then motioned for me to sit in the open chair. I didn't think, as I moved to the chair. Once seated, Adam looked me in the eyes for a few seconds. I don't believe that is a part of his power. Adam said, with a smirk. Really? Julius asked. Yes. Adam said, leaning back in his chair again. How can you tell? I asked, finally joining the conversation for the first time. A smile spread across Adam's face, showing his perfect teeth. What was your profession before you were turned into a vampire? He asked me. I was in practice to become a doctor. I said, confused as to why that was important or had anything to do with my possible power. A doctor, hey. He said, his smile never leaving his face. And what made you want to become a doctor? Adam asked me. I wanted to help people. I said strongly. My want for that exact thing, clear in my voice. Adam nodded his head. Do you know what most doctors have in common? He asked me. But before I could answer with my idea of what I believe all doctors have in common, he interrupted me by answering his own question. It's their personalities. They all have dedication, commitment, resilience, and above all, compassion. Adam said. I agreed, nodding my head. And your response to my question tells me exactly which one you have most of. Adam said, leaning forward in his chair. It's compassion, Carlile. Some would have said, to heal people or to find a cure for an ailment. And without even needing to think. You said to help people. That tells me you are a very compassionate person, with the ability to understand and empathize with the suffering of others and to show kindness and care towards them. Adam said, seeming to finally come to his point. What exactly does any of that have to do with his power? Julius asked while raising a brow. Adam let a chuckle slip from his lips. When a person is turned, their emotions intensify, becoming more vivid and intense. This means that his already strong feeling of compassion for human life has tripled. Then, he turned his head. Adam looked at Julius. Just like you, Julius. When you first turned, you were able to fight the urge for blood with your own intensified emotions. Adam said, with a laugh. Later that night, I was currently seated on the stone parapet of my room's balcony, soaking in the late night rays of the moon. From where I sat, I could also see right over the walls that were around the castle and into the still bustling town. As I sat watching a drunkard stumble his way down the main road of town, I slipped into my thoughts of earlier. Adam's appearance threw off the plans I had originally intended to enact today, which was to tell Julius and Jane of my soon-to-be departure. But after the conversation about my intensified emotions, Adam and Julius seemed to be more focused on reconnecting with each other while I sat there and listened. I wasn't sure if he was the true Adam from the Bible. He matched perfectly with the description of Adam from the Bible. But in his journals, Adam not once wrote of it. Which I felt wasn't right. I would expect the first man to exist would at least bring it up at least once in his journals. But as I had that thought, I felt a gust of wind brush by me, with a scent. Beautiful night, is it not? The voice of Adam said, from beside me. I reacted on instinct. In a blur, I was on my feet and ready to run. But what I saw was Adam leaning on the parapet smiling at me. I didn't even hear him. I thought in astonishment. Since my transformation, it had been impossible for anything to get within a few hundred feet of me, without me hearing it. Be it bugs, humans, or vampires. Relax, Carlile, I just came to talk. Adam said, as he waved a hand at me to relax. My apologies, Adam. I said as I stepped down. It's all right, Carlile. Adam said as he looked up at the full moon. We stood in silence for a solid minute before Adam spoke again. Julius tells me you have the idea that vampires don't have souls. He said, looking away from the moon and at me. Chapter 79, Something Spontaneous. Adam POV. I turned and leaned on the wall from my side to look directly at him. Don't worry, Carlile. I said, giving him a smile, you are far from the first to think this way. Carlile put his elbows on the stone wall and let out a sigh. Can you blame me for it? Carlile said. No, I can't. I said with a chuckle, but most vampires I have met don't exactly have this dilemma. So this is newer territory for us. Carlile looked over at me with a raised brow. So most vampires don't care that they are condemned to hell? He asked, in a bewildered tone. Not really, no. I said, shaking my head. When I first met Julius, he was like you. Except he was more afraid of becoming a monster, instead of a fear for his soul. I said. In fact, when I met him, souls were not really a concern for most. Carlile looked at me. When did you meet Julius? I know he is old, but you never exactly dated your passages in your journals. Carlile said. We have known each other for close to 1500 years now. I said, with a shake of the head, boy does time fly. Carlile shook his head. That is a long time. He said in a bemused tone. Then, turning to me, he said. But not as long as the creation of Earth itself, hey. I looked at him but didn't say anything. Something Julius told me was the fact that Carlile was actually a rather religious person. Who, at the moment, was on a search for religious comfort. As in, that he wasn't a damned person for the fact that he was now a vampire. After a few moments, I responded. No, not that long. After that we got quiet again. But from the distance, we could hear what sounded like a band starting to play from a tavern. A smile came to my face. Turning to look at Carlile, I asked him a question. Have you ever done anything spontaneous? He looked at me confused. No. He asked questioningly. I don't believe this is a good idea. Carlile said as we walked down the cobbled street. Oh. And why do you say that? I asked, with a laugh. Because, what if something happens, Adam? Someone got hurt, and I can't control myself. He asked. I laughed again. I will be there, and stop you if you do, but I have faith in you. I said, patting his shoulder. At the moment, we were wearing the clothes of the common man. For me, that was my normal wear. But for Carlile, I could tell he felt like a fish out of water. Which was the point of all of this. Getting closer to the tavern, the music grew louder, with the boisterous shouts and cheers of the patrons. Stopping in front of the well-kept front of the tavern, we could see inside and the heated party going on inside. "Here goes nothing," I said as I put my hand out to open the door. But was stopped, as a very drunk man slammed the door open, as he stumbled out, singing a church song as loud as he could. Stepping to the side, I let the drunk man, who didn't even notice us, go by. Looking at Carlile, I smiled. "Again, here goes nothing," I said as I turned to the door and strode in. The inside was lit by hanging lanterns and a large chandelier that had candles lit in holders in a circle. In the far corner of the room, a group of people played a fast beat and exciting tune that made you want to tap your foot. Filling the tavern was the working class man. Some were standing, while others were sitting at tables scattered around the room. Sprinkled in with them were the tavern wenches and beer maids. "Came on, Carlile. It's time for something spontaneous," I said, as I walked to the first table in front of us, which had 3 men seated at it. "I thought we were already doing something spontaneous just by being here," Carlile said as he followed behind me. Pulling a chair from an empty table, I pulled it with me as I approached the table. As I slid the chair in front of me to sit, I saw they were playing a game of dice. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said boisterously. They all turned to look at me. "Evenin'," one of the bearded men said as he shook the wooden cup holding the dice. Slamming the cup down, he lifted it. "Damn it be all!" he yelled as he saw the count. "Ha ha ha!" a grey-haired man said as he laughed at the losing man. "That be the 3rd in a row," he wheezed. The damn fool doesn't know when to quit," the 3rd younger-looking man said. And in quick succession, we had traded names, and before even I knew it, I was holding the cup and dice. "How much is the bet?" I asked as I looked at my 3 new friends. "How much you got?" the older man asked. I shrugged, then pulled my coin purse from my side, clunking it onto the table. A few of the gold fell out. "That much?" I said with a laugh, as I saw the wide eyes of the 3 men. "That'll do," all 3 said in unison. "Thought so," I said as I started to shake the cup. Slamming it down, I leaned the cup to look at the count. "Wait, what game am I even playing?" I thought. Closing the cup, I looked at the 3 other players. "And what game are we playing exactly?" I asked. "It be called numbers," he said as he looked at the cup, then back up to me. "Whoever rolls the highest number wins," he said with a wide smile. "We free-made it ourselves," the older man said, with a wide gap-filled smile. Sounds simple enough," I said as I lifted the cup. 3 6s and 2 4s. 26. I said happily as I tapped the table with my palm. "Good roll," loser said with a smug smile. "But just you wait till it be my turn. I'll show you a good roll," he continued. "Shut your gob, would you? Your yappin' be distracting," the old man said as he collected the dice and cup. As the old man shook the wooden cup viciously, a beer maid with rather large assets brought a large wooden mug to the table for me. "Here you are, love," she said, sweetly, as she delivered the beer. She was pretty-ish for a place like this, but definitely wasn't my type. Too much cleavage and not enough teeth. But maybe in the 21st century and proper dental care, she might have been a true looker. As I picked up the mug to take a sip of the foam, I realized all 3 of the men at the table were staring at me strangely. "What?" I asked as I finally took a sip of the dark brew. Slamming the wooden cup down, which he had been holding up by his head in a shaking motion, the old man yelled. "Ho!" His face was beet red, and steam almost looked to be streaming from his ears. "You been here not any more than a piss, and Betty be bringing you ale. Calm yourself, Tom, before you have another chest pain," the younger man said while pointing a finger at the older man. The old man, who I learned was named Tom, looked at the younger man. "But James, I've been coming here every day for years trying to get Betty to even look at me, be you? Enough, you geezer. She's told you more than once she's not interested," loser said, with a loud laugh. "And I've told you, it takes time for women to see my dashing looks." Turning away from their argument, I remembered I hadn't come here alone. Searching the room, I looked for the other man with light hair. It didn't take me but a moment to find him. Seated in front of the fireplace, Carlile seemed to be having a full conversation with a group of nicely dressed men. There you go, kid. Socialize like a regular human again. I thought as I turned back to my table. From there, the part took on a life of its own. And the alcohol flowed freely. As I bought round after round for the tavern patrons. I even got to run into Carlile, who seemed to be finally having some fun. Of course, neither I nor Carlile could get drunk. But that didn't mean we couldn't have fun partying with drunk people. And as it turned out, those men he had been talking to earlier were some of the town's doctors and his apprentices. We finally left the tavern as the sun was barely coming up over the horizon, and most of the people left in the tavern had fallen over blackout drunk. The air was crisp and cold. Turning to Carlile, I saw he had a small smile on his face. Come on. We have one other stop, I said, as I started walking down the street. Carlile didn't say anything this time and just decided to follow after me. It didn't take long to reach the town's only church. Walking up the path, I reached the doors. But when I turned, I saw Carlile standing just outside the church's perimeter. I let out a small sigh. You want to find out if you have a soul or not, correct? I asked him. Not needing to ask loudly, as I knew he could hear me perfectly fine. He nodded. Then come on. We're running out of time before the early risers wake up and the sun is out, I said, as I pulled open the large wooden doors that were painted black. Not waiting for him to follow me, I stepped into the large stone church. For the size of the town, this church was of moderate size, compared to some other towns, which had absolutely massive ones compared to the size of the town itself. It was probably of Julius's doing. Walking halfway up the aisle, I took a seat at one of the pews and waited. As I did so, I looked around. Although it was of moderate size, it did have excellent craftsmanship. The large glass windows that filled the back end of the church had exquisite glass artwork done to it, depicting a man with a glowing gold halo over his head, with a hand seeming to be reaching out to the viewers. And on a pedestal in front of the windows was a large gold cross. Interrupting my thoughts was the soft footsteps of Carlile as he entered the church and made his way to me, taking a seat in the pew in front of me. Carlile sat. Ah, you made it, I said, with a chuckle. Turning his head to look at me, Carlile asked. What is that supposed to mean? Leaning forward, I rested my elbows on the back of the pew he was seated at. You don't know? I asked, scrunching my brows together. Know what? He asked. I leaned back. Soulless beings can't enter holy ground, I said, looking him right in the eyes. I honestly had no idea if that was true or not, but I was hoping he would believe my words and that I was the Adam would help persuade him. Just as those who have filled their souls with the devil's words could not enter, I said, pushing my words on. Remember, Carlile. God judges the soul, not what you are on the surface, I said, my voice slowly building. I understand that you question the existence of your soul, as your nature as a vampire defies the conventional understanding of humanity. But let me assure you, your soul is not defined by the circumstances of your existence or the choices you have made, I said, and as I looked at Carlile, I saw a quiver at the corner of his lip. God's judgment transcends the boundaries of humanity, encompassing all beings, regardless of their nature or origin. He sees beyond the physical manifestations of your being and delves into the depths of your soul. Looking into the core of your being, examining the intentions, desires, and moral compass that guide your actions. My voice was now bouncing off the walls, seeming as if I was speaking to Carlile from every direction. While your existence as a vampire may be marked by immortality, thirst for human blood, and supernatural abilities, it does not mean that your soul is devoid of goodness or incapable of redemption. God's judgment is rooted in mercy and compassion, offering a path of salvation and forgiveness to all who seek it, I said, pausing for a moment, to let my words sink in. Then moving my arm, I gripped Carlile's shoulder. Your struggle to reconcile your vampiric nature with the concept of having a soul is understandable. But remember, it is not solely your actions that define your soul. It is the choices you make, and the relationships you build, as well as the capacity for love and empathy that reside within you. Just like Julius and Jane, both compassionate and virtuous vampires, should have shown you, it is possible to live a life guided by values and principles. By embracing your humanity, cultivating empathy, and striving to do what is right, you can find solace in the belief that your soul is not lost. God's judgment is not limited by neither your or my limited understanding. He sees the potential for growth and transformation within each individual, regardless of their nature. So, Carlile, do not despair. Embrace the journey of self-discovery, seek redemption, and remember that God judges the soul, not what you are. I said, in a tone I myself was surprised by. Maybe it was the fact that those were the words I wish I had said to Oliver and Gerard in an attempt to turn them into vampires. And were the words I had sought after their deaths. Then, like a miracle from the man himself, the sun shone into the glass art in front of us, turning the once impressive glass art into a true work of beauty. As the glass figure of Jesus glowed bright with the early morning sun. ___________. I would like to send a special thanks to my brother who helped me with this chapter. Specifically the whole religious rant, which I wanted to be very dramatic. And really send a message to Carlile. And let's be honest, I'm still expanding my vocabulary and would have never pulled out such words as transcends the boundaries of humanity, encompassing all beings, regardless of their nature or origin. Oh, how I wish he would be my CO writer or something. Crying face. Anywho, big thanks to, the ______out. ER80, early morning business and sad night in a crypt. Mid-afternoon the next day, I strolled into Julius's office, in my fine linen night robes Jane had given me as a gift the other day. Strolling in, I had my hands in the small side pockets as I looked in his office, as he wrote agitatedly at a parchment. If you continue to sit like that, Julius, you will become a hunchback. I said, as I flopped myself into the same chair as the day before. If I have done it for the past 1,000 years, I highly doubt it will affect me now. Julius said, not looking up from his work. I chuckled. What are you working on anyhow? I asked. Julius sat up and blew softly on the parchment to dry the still wet ink. I have just bought out the last of the East India Company's stocks. I sat upright in my chair. Say what now? I asked, startled at the familiar name. It is a joint stock company that was given a royal charter, from Queen Elizabeth I, granting it a monopoly on English trade in the East Indies. Julius said, finally looking up at me. Yes, I know that. I said, slowly sitting back again, before I continued. What made you want to take over the East India Company? For one, it is a bountiful opportunity to make gold, as well as a perfect way to boost trade in England. Julius said as he set the parchment down on his desk. And I did not like the way they were growing as a company. He continued. What do you mean? I asked. They are starting to think of themselves as the owners of India itself. Enacting heavy tariffs, taxes, and levies on the local population of certain areas. Julius said, shaking his head agitatedly. The reports I have been receiving from the bank head in India confirms just as much. He continued by pulling a few tattered sheets from the massive pile on his desk. Handing them over, I read through the paper. Yes. It seems they were starting to get more involved in the political and militaristic side of things instead of focusing on trade and friendship. I said, setting the parchments back on the desk. They were well on their way to becoming an occupying force if I didn't step in. Julius said as he leaned back in his chair. It was only a little over 4 million gold, so it wasn't that big of a problem, but it was certainly heading in that direction. I couldn't help but smile. You did the right thing, Julius. I said, standing. Beside the fact you are helping a country boost their trade with fair deals, you are also stopping what could have also been a forceful takeover. I said, smiling at him. Yes, that is true. Julius said, sitting up in his chair, ready to get back to work. I would send a letter to the bank head in India. I said as I turned to leave. Put him in charge of finding the goods for our new company to sell. But make sure we take the bare minimum from the sales, giving most of the profit back to the Bank of India to invest back into the country. I said, as I exited the large room. Going back to my large opulent room. I got changed out of my 2 fancy morning clothes and back into what I was more comfortable in. Which was knee-length breeches, long socks, and then boots that reached my knees. Sort of like cavalry boots, but not as firm. From there, I put on a tunic and then a tan cloak. Once done getting dressed, I tied my hair into a ponytail, the length of which was hidden under my cloak. I looked myself over in a mirror I had in the corner of my room. I couldn't stop myself from smiling. Exiting the large castle, I requisitioned a horse from the stables before heading out. My plan was to get out and explore the new London I had found myself in. The ride was nice, and the shopping was even better. As I stuffed my horse's saddlebags with the random knickknacks of the street vendors of London. A little after evening, I finally made my way back to the castle, where I could hear the band playing once again in the tavern as I passed it. Reaching the stables, I gave the stable boy a gold coin as I pulled the saddlebags from the horse. From there, I started to make my way back to the castle itself when something caught my attention from the corner of my eyes. I knew what it was instantly. But it was something I had been trying to avoid. No, not anymore. I need to face this, I thought, as I turned on my heels, and made my way to the castle church. Slowly pushing open the wooden door, I saw that the church was empty. Closing the wooden door behind me, I laid the saddlebags over a pew as I walked down the aisle towards the altar of the church. Stopping in front of the marble altar, I read the words chiseled into his side out loud. In perpetuum uniti, in perpetuum memorati, in perpetuum grey. Forever united, forever remembered, forever grey. A small smile crept onto my face as I started to push the top of the marble altar to the side, revealing the entrance to the crypt. Walking to one of the close-by torches, I grabbed it to help with the cobwebs that were bound to be down there. Dropping the 7 feet to the stone flooring, I raised the torch above my head and looked around. The crypt was roughly 200 feet long and 30 feet wide. On both sides were carved pockets that had pre-made stone coffins. Those close to me were still empty, but making my way down the long crypt, I saw that the farther I went, the more tombs were filled, which slightly saddened me. It's a part of mortality. You live, you die, I thought. They all had good lives living under the protection of Julius and Jane. My thoughts continued. After a few minutes of slowly walking, the sight of the 4 tombs finally came into sight. The 4 tombs were of Oliver, Gerard, and their wives. Finally stopping in front of the 4, I looked down at the carved image of them that laid atop their tombs. The stonework for each of them were masterpieces. And as I looked down at the polished stone, a sad smile spread across my face. How I have missed all of you, I said softly in the quiet crypt. As much as it hurt me, I knew this would more than likely be far from the last time I would come down here late at night. Because I knew to heal, I needed to accept the fact that this is my life, and those I love will die. Loved ones, friends, foes, immortals, and mortals will all one day be nothing more than dust, while I will have no other choice but to continue on. Chapter 81, Leaving and Concert. Right there is perfect, I said as the group of men set down the large instrument. Thank you, gentlemen, I said to the trio of sweating men. Captain, if you would show these men out, I asked the guard captain, who was standing in the doorway watching the 3 movers with his hawk eyes. Yes, Lord, he said with a bow of his head, before showing them the way out. Now alone in my large room, I turned to look at my new toy. A cheeky smile dawned on my face, as I slowly took a seat on the padded bench, cracking my fingers in intimidation of the fun I was about to have. Maximum effort, I said, as I brought my fingers down on the ivory keys. Bong bong, bong, ping, ping, bong. What in the name is that noise? I heard Julius shout from his office below me. But I ignored him as I continued to press the keys excitedly. And like the party pooper I knew he would be, Julius came blurring into my room. Would you quit that infuriating noise? Julius said, as he held his hands over his ears. What? I said loudly, pretending not to be able to hear him. Stop that! Julius shouted. Fine, I said, finally stopping the sound. Lowering his hands from his ears, Julius gave me a stern look. What, in the blazes is that thing? Julius asked, as he looked at my purchase. It's called a harpsichord, I said, as I pressed a few of the keys again. And why is it here? Julius asked, annoyed. Because I want to learn to play it, I said, with snark. Julius rolled his eyes. Why do you want to learn something that makes such a racket? Learn to play the harp, or perhaps the violin? Julius asked, as he gave a peeved look at my harpsichord. I will in due time, Julius, I said with another smirk, as I pointed past him at the corner of my room, where a large pile of this century's instruments were stacked. Oh, you have to be joking, Julius said, as he looked at the large pile. Yes, I said evilly. What was that sound? Jane asked, as she entered the room. Julius turned to look at her, then at me. It would seem Adam has decided to become a bard, he said. It's called musician, Julius. Nobody is called a bard anymore. That went out of fashion half a century ago, I said with a snicker, as he gave me a scowl. Yes, Well, that's nice and all. But the reason I came up here is because Carlile wants to talk to all of us. Jane said, as she turned to leave. That's strange. Julius said, as he looked at the light streaming from one of the many large windows in my room. Normally he's nose deep in one of the old books in the library at this time. He finished. Well, let's not sit here and wonder what he wants, and instead go and find them. I said, as I stood. We found them in Julius's office. Both seated in the two chairs in front of Julius's large desk. Afternoon, Carlile. I said, as I entered. Good afternoon, Adam. Carlile responded. Walking to the desk, I leaned on it. While Julius sat in his large chair. So, what's going on? I asked, as we all looked at Carlile. Looking at him, I could tell he was nervous about whatever he wanted to talk about. I want to leave. Carlile said haltingly. I looked at him, then at Jane and Julius. That's what this is about? I asked for the rest of us. Yes. Carlile said, as he looked at Julius. I'm grateful for the guidance both you and Jane have given me. But I have a new thirst for the world which I now have the opportunity to see. Carlile said, still sounding worried at what our response might be. Julius let out a chuckle. Carlile. Did you think I wouldn't let you leave? He asked with a smile. Not exactly. In all honesty, I expected you to be disappointed that I would even want to leave. Julius again let out a laugh at his response. Carlile, we wouldn't be disappointed that you would want to leave. Jane said, from beside Carlile. We ourselves wanted to explore the greater world at one time. She said with a smile. Yup, and I dragged them to some of my old stomping grounds. I said with a smile, as Carlile looked at me. Of course, many of those places aren't there anymore. Or they are completely different by this point. Julius tapped the table a few times. Why don't you take him? He asked. I looked at him in surprise. I just got back, and you are already trying to get rid of me. I said to him, in a fake affronted voice. And in honesty, a part of me didn't want to leave. Which confused me. Was it just because traveling has finally gotten old? Or was it because I was tired of being alone, and separated from my adopted family? I stood to my feet and looked at Carlile, who hadn't said a word in protest to me joining him. And where did you have in mind? I asked him. Well, from here in London we could take a ship and start in Germany. Carlile said, clearly rehearsed. Then from there we could go west to France, then down to Italy. Carlile continued. Slowly picking up speed after every word. And then? I asked. Carlile raised one of his brows. I haven't decided where to go from there. Carlile admitted in a sheepish tone. I don't see a problem with that. I said with a smile. But from Italy we can get to Alexandria, then on to see the pyramids, where we can access the entire Middle East, then India and Asia. I said, slowly standing, as Carlile looked at me with wide eyes. It's always good to expand your horizon. 1673/France. Adam, I don't believe this is a good idea. Carlile said, as I finished tying the large black cloak around me. Those are starting to sound like your favorite words, Carlile. I said, turning to look at him. At the moment we were standing in my small dressing room where I was getting dressed in my new outfit, or better yet my new costume. My outfit was a completely black cloak that had a large hood. Underneath that, I wore completely black underclothes to finish off the intimidating ensemble. I don't know if you know this or not. But I am a person who does fun things as I find them. This just so happens to be my newest interest. I said, as I turned and opened an ornate wooden box. You call this fun? Carlile asked, as he looked in the direction of a gentle hum. Yup. I said playfully, as I pulled what was placed in the box out. Turning to look at Carlile, I smiled at him. It's a good way to make time not seem so slow. I said as I brought the completely white mask up and over my face. Lifting the hood, I asked. How do I look? I asked, as I looked through the small pinprick-size holes where I saw out. Creepy. Carlile said, as he shook his head. The idea came to me when I was reminiscing on some old shows when we were making our way down from Germany to France. I remembered what the mask of Obito Uchiha looked like, and knew it would work perfectly for what I had been planning for some time. The only modifications I made was to make it completely white, and made the eye holes smaller. as if there were no eye holes at all. "Sir! The show is about to begin," a young voice said from outside our door. "Thank you," I said, as I turned back to Carlile. "You should go to your seat," I said, as I turned and left the room. Leaving the room, I walked down the cramped hallway as I made my way to the stage. As I went, everyone I passed gave me a wide berth, as they looked at me wide-eyed. Some in wonder, and others in fright. Finally making it to the stage, I saw the lone harpsichord sitting center stage. At the moment the curtains were drawn closed, allowing me to approach it while I heard the semi-loud murmur of the crowd who were seated on the other side. Taking my seat, I looked up at the man standing just off stage, who was waiting for my nod. As soon as it was given, the man started to tug on a large rope, opening the curtains. The crowd went dead silent in less than a second, as they saw me seated at the harpsichord. Turning to look at them, I wanted them to see the mask I wore. But only for a second, as I turned back and started to play. I wanted to grab their attention from the beginning. So with practiced movements, I started to play Crab Rave. There are actual covers of these songs on harpsichord. At first it started out slow, with me hitting the same keys for a few moments, throwing the crowd into a confused lull to the newer sound. But in an instant I used my free foot to hit the ground rhythmically as I switched the beat to a faster tempo, while I bobbed my head with the music. Coming to a stop as I played the last few notes, I turned to look at the crowd, and their reactions, which were mostly shock. As I looked, I was able to see the figure of Carlile seated in one of the private booths above the rest of the crowd. He was seated next to a distinguished-looking man with curly black hair, and fine clothes. Perks of knowing kings, I thought ruefully, as I saw the King of France turn and ask Carlile a question, as a slow clap started to fill the large theatre. As the clapping got louder, I bowed my head while still seated, and started to play again. This time I played Here Comes the Sun. Again I used my foot to create a tempo that the crowd soon took up. From there I started to play whatever came to mind. From the coffin song, to DRDRE. And they loved it. Of course I had to throw in a few time period songs that would fit in more with this century. All thanks to my Spotify, I was able to practice songs I had never even known existed. Chapter 82, No Entry and Succubuses. So you have never been here before? Carlile asked as we looked out from the ship's deck. Yeah, I never really got the chance to come here before, I said as I looked at the quickly approaching shore. At the moment, we were quickly approaching Edo, otherwise known as Tokyo, Japan. This was my first time ever coming here, so I was a little excited to finally be coming here. What put the idea in my head was when we were in Portugal. A ship from Japan was docked. And well, that's when it hit me. Holy shit, I've been everywhere, America included, but never to Japan. So, I got to know the crew a bit. Learned their language and managed to get passage for both me and Carlile, who, by the way, was really enjoying this trip. Since we had left, I had brought him to towns or cities I knew contained covens. I myself had tried greatly to stay away from them. But Carlile seemed to have quite the interest in them, as well as knowledge. The man was like a sponge for the stuff, medical knowledge in particular. Which I figured he would be, especially considering what I had already known about the man before, which seemed to not have changed with me being here. In what seemed to be no time, the ship veered its way through the very crowded waters of Edo's harbor. Docking the ship, we grabbed our belongings and stepped onto the harbor. Thankfully, today was rather cloudy, so Carlile didn't need to wear the large straw hat we had made for him. Instead, we were wearing our normal European clothes. As we were grabbing our belongings and about to head into the city proper, a large group of men came down the harbor. As they went, the people who cluttered the dock separated to let them pass. As they got close, I was able to see that they were all wearing swords at their waists. But as for their clothes, they all wore kimonos with sleeveless-looking jackets or vests over them. Hirori! Quickly, they were huddled in front of us. Do you have a permit for being here? The leading man said in Japanese as he shoved his hands into his sleeves. Permit? I asked in confusion. Yes. Under Tokugawa shogunate law, all foreigners need a permit to enter, the man said, as he looked at both me and Carlile. I looked at Carlile. Did you know we needed a permit? I whispered. He looked at me and lightly shook his head. Turning back to the short man who looked to be in charge. And how exactly do we get a permit? I asked. You can't. Now leave. The man said, his voice becoming steely. I raised a brow. And how are we supposed to leave? I asked. He raised his arm to another close-by ship. That ship is leaving soon. Be on it. He said before turning to leave. His men followed close behind. I turned to look at Carlile. Don't. I said, raising a finger at him, as I saw his lips curl into a smile. Well, this is quite the trip we are having. Carlile said with a laugh. Yeah. I said as I made my way towards the ship that was getting ready to leave. 1683. At the moment, we were passing through a town in the Kingdom of Hungary, but will one day become Slovakia, on our way back to England. We were passing through Bratislava, the largest town in this area. Both I and Carlile were seated on a wagon being driven by a farmer we paid from the previous town to help carry our belongings we had accumulated over the decade of travel. Looking up at the cloudy sky, I said. This would be the perfect place to live for a while. Carlile looked up from his book. What do you mean? Carlile asked. It's always cloudy and would give you and the others the perfect opportunity to live normal lives out in the open. I said, as the wagon hit a rather large divot in the road. I don't miss this kind of travel one bit. I said as I adjusted myself. As I continued to complain to Carlile, who had gone back to reading his book, a flash of something caught my attention from a distance. I snapped my head to the side to get a better look. Fuck. I said, as I leaned forward to get a better look. What is it? Carlile asked, as he saw my actions. Look. I said, as I pointed down the busy dirt road that was bustling with people. Turning his head, Carlile looked at what I was pointing at. I don't see anything. He said, as he scanned the crowd of people. There, the blondes. I said, as I moved my finger to follow the moving trio. Carlile sat upright as he saw what I was pointing at. Vampires. Carlile said, as he saw the perfect features of the three women. Yet. I said, as I nodded my head. Turning to look at me, Carlile asked. Do you know them? No. I said, turning to look at him. Then why such a reaction? He asked. It's because I know of them. I said, turning back, to watch as the three walked down the road in our direction. Really? Carlile asked. Yet. Ever wondered where the idea of succubuses came from? I asked. Not exactly. But I'm assuming they have something to do with it. He asked. Yes. I know the way they feed is by luring men in with their looks. Then in the throes of passion they strike. Carlile raised a brow. I see. Then before I knew what was happening, Carlile was jumping from the back of the wagon. Carlile! What are you doing? I whispered. But he didn't even look at me, as he approached them. Damn it! I said, as I grabbed a gold coin. Here, we will be right back. I said to the farmer, as I also jumped from the back of the wagon to follow Carlile. I quickly managed to catch up with him. Are you trying to get yourself killed or something? I asked in a peeved tone. No. But I knew you would follow. Carlile said cheerily. The stupidity of youth. I said with a shake of the head. I'm over 60 now. Carlile said, as he looked at me. And? I'm nearly 7,000 years old. You're not even a speck of dust on the age scale. I said, as the Denalis finally caught sight of us. All three of them came to abrupt halts, as they saw us. All three of them had their golden blonde hair on display, and were wearing dark brown cloaks around them. Hello. Carlile said in a normal tone, even though we stood at most 10 feet apart. Not one of them moved a muscle as they looked us over as well. It was clear neither I or Carlile were regular humans. Carlile, pale, with perfect-looking features, was clearly a vampire. While I on the other hand was more than likely, strange to them. Let alone my hair, I also had the same perfect features as a vampire. I also stood out because I wasn't pale, and I'm sure I had a scent they could smell, telling them I was human. We don't want trouble. I said, stepping slightly in front of Carlile. We are just passing through. I said in their native language. Chapter 83, The Denalis and the Unwritten Rules. Who are the both of you? The leading woman, who if I remembered correctly was named Tanya, asked sternly. My name is Adam. I said, pointing at myself. And this is Carlile. I finished, pointing at Carlile. What are you doing here? The other sister, Irina, asked, also sternly from beside her sister. Like I said, we were just passing through. I said, putting my hands up as people walked past us. Why are your eyes gold? The third sister Kate asked, sounding confused while also intrigued. It's from the way I feed. Carlile said, passing by me to stand in front. What? Tanya asked as she tilted her head to the side. There is only one way to feed. Irina said, now sounding angry. That is far from the truth. Carlile interjected before she could continue. We can also survive on animal blood. All three of them turned to look at each other. That's impossible. Irina said angrily before turning to leave. The other two looked at each other for a moment, then at us once more before turning to follow their sister. Well, that was interesting. Carlile said as we watched them leave. I said before I grabbed Carlile by the shoulder. Now, what were you thinking? I asked as I whirled him around. You can't just approach other vampires like that. Most who stay in one area like them are very territorial and might have tried to kill you on sight. All these witnesses be damned. I said sternly, chiding him like a little kid. Yes. I realize that now. Carlile said, looking at the regular people who were passing by us, then down at the ground. I acted on instinct. I let out a long sigh. Come on. We need to get going. I said as I turned back towards the cart while glancing over my shoulder. Later that night, when we were sitting in front of a fire on top of one of the many large hills in this region, Carlile spoke. I'm sorry, Adam. I looked up from the fire and at him. Since the incident earlier, we hadn't said more than a few words to each other. I know, Carlile. I said, rotating the goat meat I had kebabbed on a metal rod, with fresh red beets I had gotten from a vendor before we had left the city limits in our driver. And I'm not mad at you if that is what you are thinking. I said. I saw Carlile's head slowly look up at me. I'm mad at myself. I continued. I should have known you would want to meet other vampires and should have gone over some important rules with you. I said, as I brought the sizzling kebab up to inspect. When you were with Julius and Jane, they taught you control over yourself. But never went over the rules and politics of vampire society. So we have been going about this whole trip as if there are no risks out here that could affect us. I said. Let me start with the whole political side of this and go from there. I said, as I finished off the last of my food. Tossing the metal rod I was using as a square to the side, I leaned back on my pack and began. All the way at the very top of the vampiric food chain is the vulture. I said as Carlile nodded. I have read about them in one of your journals. He said. I nodded. Then you know they are a bunch of megalomaniacs who are currently the ruling faction of the vampire race. I asked. He nodded. Good. I said with a smile, but don't get the wrong idea of them. They might be a bunch of jackanapes, but they do hold a firm hold on the vampire world, keeping unnecessary death from occurring, as well as keeping vampires hidden from humans. I said, while Carlile nodded his head while listening intently. Below them, you have the stationary covens. Those are the larger groups of vampires of maybe 10 to 15 who principally stay in the larger cities. Yes, there are smaller ones who are stationary, like the group we just met. But those are rare and far between. I said. The vulture allow such groups? Carlile asked. I nodded. They do. So long as they don't grow too big to possibly become a threat to their power or draw too much attention to themselves. After the stationary covens are the nomads. These groups are small, mostly numbering up to 3 or 4 members at a time. They travel from city to city or town to town. Never settling down in one spot. And normally, don't come into contact with other vampires. I said. How come? Carlile asked. Well, most of them are sole survivors of their covens. I said, with a snort. The vulture are big on letting one live to spread word of what happens to covens who go against Aro's rule. I said as I shook my head. But what they are actually doing is slowly building a mass of vampires who want to see their fall. For the rest of the night, I continued to talk to Carlile about vampire politics, as well as the importance of the vampire race staying hidden from humans. We also decided on visiting a few covens I had heard of, which were friendlier than some of the other covens. I myself never exactly tried to find them, and I just left them alone. But Carlile seemed adamant about it. So I agreed. But I did put my foot down on Carlile meeting with the Volturi. Who knew what they would do to him just to get back at me, knowing he was close to us. So, instead of continuing east to France, we headed northeast to Germany. 1705 New York. Don't say it, Carlile. I said, as the large ship was being tied to the docks. He turned to look at me. Don't say what? He asked with a chuckle. At least we don't need a permit. I said in my best imitation of Carlyle's voice. He grinned at me. I would never. Carlile said in a fake abashed tone. Sure. I said, giving him a look. Since our talk in Slovakia, we have met with 4 covens in total. 2 in Germany, 1 in France, and another one in Spain. Are you excited? I asked Carlile as we waited for the ship to finish docking. I am. Carlile said with a smile. And are you sure you will be okay? I asked. He turned to look at me. Yes, Adam. For the 4,000th time. Carlile said with a chuckle. What? I asked, I'm just 4,000th checking. I said with a laugh. It's not every day a vampire opens their own medical practice. I continued as I shook my head. I have been practicing on our travels while you were off doing whatever it is you get up to, Adam. I have long since been able to handle blood. Carlile said as he patted my shoulder. After another few minutes, we were finally able to get off the ship. At the moment, all we carried was 1 large pack each. The rest of our belongings we had shipped back to Julius and Jane at the castle for storage. What I also sent was a letter asking Julius to deliver a large chest of gold for any expenses we might need to pay. We had on us a nearly king's ransom in gold. But you just never know what life might throw at you. Like what I saw when I stepped onto the dock. Oh fuck. I blurted out, as I turned to look around us. I forgot about that. I said, as a group of slaves were busy carrying large sacks from a cart onto a ship. Shocked at my outburst, Carlile turned to look at me. What did you forget? He asked. I forgot about slavery. I said, as I dropped my bag, and smacked my forehead. __. I didn't make the meeting with the Denali coven very long. Just long enough for Carlile to put the idea of animal blood as a substitute for human blood in their minds. Because in the research I did, it said that the Denali sisters, one of them isn't even biologically their sister, were starting to feel bad about their actions. As in killing their food while having sex with them. Yucky. And from what I gathered from the books and the movies, Irina was always the bitchy one, so I decided to keep that going. But to be fair, when I wrote that part I was imagining them all already feeling terrible for what they have to do to survive, then some dude just showed up and threw what they thought was impossible in their faces. So I could also see her reactions as feasible. And yes, Adam did kinda forget about slavery. But remember, that was a very common thing back then. And I mean everywhere. It's something he has lived with for thousands of years, and has become accustomed to. As weird as that might sound. But don't worry, he will stop that from happening in the US as well as a few other places to avoid future problems. This is where the MC is going to make some waves in history. And be a part of American history. No, he won't become the president, but he will have a big role in the Revolution of Independence. If you have any other questions, please leave a comment, and I will try my best to reply. Also, the reason most vampire covens are territorial is because they are afraid that if too many vampires are in one place at the same time, they will draw the attention of the residents, which will force the Volturi to come and kill them all. Also, the reason I made his actions in Europe vague is because later I have a good idea for cool moments when stories of the past start to pop up, and the other characters start to realize how much Adam was a part of history. Chapter 84, Taking Action. This chapter is going to be mostly summarized. We ended up deciding to just build Carlile his practice in one of the busier areas of this era's version of New York. Which wasn't even a shadow of what it will one day become. Doing it like this allowed us to wait for Julius to send people over to open a branch of grain gots here, which will give me a steady revenue as well as a strong backing for what I had planned. The workers we had hired to build a 2-story structure for Carlyle's medical practice had just finished when the Gringotts delegation arrived in New York. They came in a fleet of 9 massive ships from our trading section. One ship held the delegation members, who would deal with the local government as well as any issues that might arise from the locals. On 3 of the other ships were the 400 members of the Gringotts Legion. All for the protection of the ships as well as the 2 ships stuffed with gold for the purchase of the land for the bank, as well as the materials needed to build it. The other 3 ships were warships, each sporting 100 cannons each. To say their arrival stirred up the locals would be an understatement. It is known worldwide that wherever Gringotts opens a bank, the locals as well as the kingdom or city-state would prosper greatly. For the locals, as well as the economy. The locals because there will always be a need for jobs. From building the large bank that was always a staple of Gringotts, to the staff needed to work the bank. The economy, because Gringotts was a large exporter of local goods, and always paid fairly for anything we bought. Sending more money to the people. I didn't go to meet with the delegation's leader when they arrived, as I didn't want to get in the way of them dealing with the local government. So, for the first few months, I stayed and helped Carlile in his medical endeavors. I didn't help with stitching people up, but instead with herbal remedies, which I had thousands of years of experience with. Quickly, the medical shop took off, and Carlile was having to hire helping hands, which was good for me, because I figured it was a good enough time to finally go and meet with the delegation. The bank decided to build the new bank in the Manhattan area, a few blocks from the harbor. They bought the land from a second-generation farmer who inherited the land. It wasn't much, only about 40 or so acres. Which was good, because I didn't want this bank to be like all the others, which normally kept the gold underground. With all the underground train tunnels that would one day crisscross under all 5 boroughs, I figured it would just be best not to interfere with that. Instead, this bank was going to have all the gold stashed in large safes above ground. So this bank was going to need to be much larger. I made my way to the new location of the bank, where I knew the new bank head was going to be, who was also the leader of the delegation. I was wearing new clothes that Carlile had talked me into wearing. The coat was tailored with wide lapels, cuffs, and intricate decorative buttons. The waistcoat, worn underneath the coat, was also embellished with embroidery patterns. Then plain breeches, which were knee-length pants, worn with stockings and buckled shoes. To complete the look, I wore a tricorn hat and carried a walking stick. I also had a nice gold pocket watch that I twirled on the chain. In layman terms, I looked, as well as felt, like a clown. A rich one at that. Because apparently, it wasn't proper to show up to the business I started in whatever I wanted. But instead, I was to show up in clothes that fit my status with those who I was going to meet. Which I found funny, as I was a religious figure to most of the top brass of my bank, who probably wouldn't really care what I was wearing. The meeting went smoother than I had originally thought it was going to. As soon as the guards saw my beat and battered gold card, I was instantly escorted to the large tent that was holding the delegation as they did their work. What surprised me was the new uniforms that my legionary guards were wearing. Gone was the armor, helmets, shields, and swords of the original legionary. Instead, they now wore uniforms that resembled what English soldiers wore. Except, instead of red, they wore purple coats, and pure black pants, with muskets. I read Julius all over that decision. But at least the captains and lieutenants still wore the legionary sword. I knew it was bound to happen eventually, but that didn't mean I had to like it. But to be fair, it's not like I could have armored legionary soldiers patrolling my banks in the 21st century in full regalia, or perhaps, nah. The new bank head was a large man, not fat or anything, but instead looked to be built like a brick shit house. As it turned out, the man was German and could speak almost perfect English. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Schmidt, and was a nice enough fellow who seemed very interested in my idea. By the end of the day, that exact plan was written out and sent to Julius, who would be able to enact them. The plan mostly contained the names of people we would be bribing, as well as orders to send my hundreds of protection/warships to Africa to shoo away anyone who was going to buy slaves until my plan could come to fruition. My plan wasn't to bribe the kingdoms with gold, though. Most of the countries that were involved in the African slave trade, besides England, were kingdoms that didn't have my banks in them. Such as Portugal, Spain, France, and Norway. So, I was going to bribe them with building my banks in their kingdoms. The countries that did have my banks and were involved, I would just bribe the rulers. Like in England, I would be bribing Queen Anne. All of them I would have pass laws banning the trading of slaves of any ethnicity. Of course, that wasn't enough to completely stop slavery, which was a deeply rooted problem. So I went for something everyone also had a deep connection to, religion. That's right, I bribed the church. Or, to be more exact, I bribed the Pope. Delegations were sent to the Vatican, with 100 chests of gold. Pope Clement XI was more than happy to take our donation. Within a month, he started a campaign to stop slavery. As soon as I got a written quote from the Vatican of one of the Pope's speeches to his cardinals, I opened printing shops across the colonies, all printing his words. Let us proclaim with unwavering faith and resolute conviction that all humankind, created in the divine image, are bound together by the sacred bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood. In the eyes of the divine, there exists no distinction of race, ethnicity, or social status. Every individual, regardless of their station in life, is deserving of dignity, respect, and freedom. For it is written in our holy scriptures, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." Let this commandment be etched upon our hearts, guiding our actions and shaping our society. Slavery, that abhorrent institution that tarnishes the very essence of humanity, must be abolished. It is a blight upon our collective conscience, a violation of the divine order, and a denial of the inherent worth of every soul. To keep another human being in chains is to defy the divine plan, to deny the fundamental truth that we are all equal in the eyes of God. Let us cast aside the shackles of ignorance and prejudice and embrace the teachings of compassion and justice. For it is through love, understanding, and forgiveness that we shall bring an end to this dark chapter in our history. As followers of the faith, we are called to be instruments of liberation and advocates for justice. Let us rise as a united voice, speaking out against the injustice of slavery and working tirelessly to dismantle its oppressive systems. May our prayers be the catalyst for change, our actions, the embodiment of our faith, and our love, the driving force behind the eradication of this deplorable institution. Today, we declare our unwavering commitment to the liberation of all enslaved souls. We call upon governments, religious leaders, and individuals of conscience to join us in this noble cause. Together, let us strive to create a world where every person is free, where the chains of bondage are broken, and where the light of justice and compassion shines brightly for all. In the name of our shared humanity, in the name of our faith, we declare that slavery shall be no more. May our words and actions echo throughout history, inspiring generations to come and ensuring that the divine commandment of freedom and equality is upheld for all eternity. Signed, Pope Clement XI. This is the time I really started to realize how much power my banks had. Especially when kings and queens started to fall over themselves to get my banks into their kingdoms, by passing laws banning all forms of slavery. For a very long time, I only thought of my banks as my personal piggy bank, which, in a way, it was. But in reality, Gringotts banks held an insane amount of political power all over the world. Not only for the status of having our banks in their country, but also for the revenue it brings. And as I later found out, we also held a metric fuck-ton of blackmail over some very powerful individuals' heads, like Galatians. Moving on. Something else I did was buy all remaining slaves in America that weren't already bought yet. After doing so, I instantly set them free. Me doing so, allowed the newspaper I had in New York named the New York Times to start printing stories of my actions to everyone. Of course they didn't use my name, and instead I was described as a rich individual who followed the Pope's words, and set the available slaves in America free like any good religious man should. And after I printed a letter I had received from the Pope for my actions, everyone and their granny started to do the same, mostly. Of course there were still holdouts who were determined to keep their slaves working their farms' fields. Such as people from religious groups. So I bought their farms, stock, and barrel. And within 10 years, America was a slave-free country, along with most of the other kingdoms. I know without a doubt that slavery couldn't have been ended so quickly. But I figured it was best just to make it seem so I don't have to write a bunch of chapters about it in depth. Because I'm ready to get to the main story. Chapter 85, The Start of a Revolution and Congressman. 1765. Boston, Massachusetts. I have done it. What did I do, you might be asking? Well, let me tell you. I have become one of the first members of the Sons of Liberty. As to how, well, it was actually pretty simple. Samuel Adams was a rather vocal opposer to the British Stamp Act. As in going to the streets in protest, rallying support from the residents of Boston. And well, let's just say I just so happened to be in the area, and saw a man like that could use some funds to support him. That's right. All I had to do was give him money to pay for any costs the Sons of Liberty may incur. The fact I also owned almost every newspaper in the colonies helped. Of course, I didn't actually have any actual animosity towards the British Empire. But that was because I was mega rich, so the taxes they were enacting didn't affect me. But it did affect the little people of the 13 colonies. Most people were already scraping by. But now, with extra taxes dumped on their heads, they were drowning. Of course, I could probably make the British Empire lessen the pressure they were putting on the colonies. But if I did that, I wouldn't be able to enact one of my biggest fantasies. Which was to see, as well as help with, the American Revolution. Maybe it was petty of me to do, but America needed to become independent, and there was really only one way that would happen. At the moment, me and Samuel were in cahoots with other Liberty members. My role was to print anti-stamp tax flyers, while the other members would go around at night and nail them everywhere. Normally, I would be heavily taxed on the paper I used to make those exact flyers. Except I had the paper bought in France then shipped, by my own ships, to me in Massachusetts all in secrecy. The reason it had to be done in secrecy was because England no longer used my ships to transport goods to the American colonies. In fact, they directly told my bank head in England that if any of my ships did not sell their goods in England to the Crown, it would put my bank against the Crown. So, in other words, my ships had to sell any goods they might have brought to the colonies and sold tax-free to England, where the Crown would then expect us to sell to them at almost no profit for us prices. Also they can turn around and ship it to America, where it would then be sold with tax. My guess was since they didn't have India under their thumb, it made them a lot poorer than in the original history. But that did not mean they were weaker. England still held a very impressive army that was well trained and hardened to battle in places like Austria, Quebec, and again, the Spanish to the south of the colonies. If I didn't want the American Revolution to happen, I would have been more than happy to pull my bank, along with all shipping from England. But only God knows what would happen if I did that, especially with a mad king at the helm of their kingdom. It also wasn't that big of an issue for use. We still had the Indian sea trade that we could take to other kingdoms who would be glad to buy from us. Like France, who was in the middle of a rather shaky part of their history. 1770. Over the past 5 years, I had become quite the notarized person in the city of Boston, as well as the colony of Massachusetts. It wasn't hard to see I was a like-minded man to Samuel Adams and the other members of the Sons of Library to the people who knew of me. Especially, when my papers continued to slander the Crown and the actions they were taking to push down on the great people of the colonies. During this time, I took on my oldest alias of Adam Gotts. One of, if not the, wealthiest men in all of the colonies. Of course, I was, without a doubt, the wealthiest man in the entire world. But the everyday Joe didn't need to know that fact. Since joining the Sons of Liberty, I have built an entire persona for myself. To the world, I was a wealthy young man, of above-average intellect, who inherited a fortune from my father, along with nearly every printing shop, of any worth, in all the colonies, as well as a significant amount of land with active farms with resident farmers, paying me yearly. It was also well known that most, if not all, of the money I got from my farms and printing shops went back into the colonies, as donations to the colonies from myself, Adam Gotts. These donations were put in use for the betterment of the citizens of Boston. Building new schools and roads, and I even collaborated with Benjamin Franklin to build a large library for the residents of Boston. And let me say, the man was smart, but at the same time a little snobbish, arrogant, and quite the womanizer. 7. I took a larger part in the limelight after I and a few other significant figures managed to halt the Boston Massacre from happening. I intervened by bringing Mr. Samuel Adams and his cousin John Adams with me for a late-night stroll where we mistakenly came upon the riot. Doing it like this allowed Samuel, his cousin John, and myself, all notable figures in the community, to defuse the situation. But that didn't mean we didn't later bash and let everyone in all 13 colonies know what the Redcoats were about to do to the innocent men, women, and children who were present during the protest. This happening this way, didn't get people immediately up in arms. Instead, it was a slower burn, but in the end, I knew it would still end up with the same result. 1775. Well, it has finally begun. The first battles of Concord and Lexington have happened. Unfortunately, I could not be there, as I had to go to Philadelphia, as I was now a part of the Second Continental Congress. With notable figures such as Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Hancock. I was chosen along with Samuel Adams, and John Hancock, by the Provisional Massachusetts Congress, to represent Massachusetts. The main reason I was chosen was for my reputation in the colonies and the substantial donations I had made to the Commonwealth of the colony. Unfortunately, I wasn't a part of the First Continental Congress because at the time, I was in New York dealing with the whole England wanting to buy all of our trade for pennies on the quarters.
Thanks for listening.